I don't think that LLMs are the end of AI. I think they are going to be very useful managers of other things, and in fact the technology has to go beyond n-gram models for it to actually be what I would call AI complete. So intelligence is ability to actually put things together to derive conclusions, right? Knowing a whole bunch of things approximately is what LLMs have. So I'm very actually surprised that Jeff Hinton thought, wow, this is just tells me that now this is going to kill humanity. That I don't quite see. OpenAI is not open at all. I mean, it has the word name open. I mean, but basically it was started as completely open. Everything will be given out. And now basically they became a company. This is going to be a bigger issue with systems like ChatGPT. After all, I mean, this thing has been trained on the world's data, and how can it be wrong? Maybe it's right. Okay, ask it to write a bio of you. And because in a biography, it will get a whole bunch of things right. So you're really impressed. But it'll also get a whole bunch of things wrong. And you may be able to tell what are wrong, but everybody else who says the same question, give me a bio of Jay Shah, will actually looks like, this must be what Jay Shah is.
So today I'm talking to Dr. Subbarao Kambhampati. He's a professor of computer science at Arizona State University and the director of the Yochan lab, where his research focuses on decision making and planning, specifically in the context of human-aware AI systems. He has been named fellow of AAAI, AAAS, and ACM in recognition of his research contributions, and also has received Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Maryland and Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. It's nice to finally chat with you in person, Professor Rao.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so I want to start very simple. So there's a huge buff around ChatGPT, and people from different disciplines have been very intrigued by what ChatGPT is doing. Some are angry, some are curious, and some are very optimistic. So in very layman terms, what exactly is ChatGPT doing whenever I ask it a question?
So ChatGPT is an old idea, but on steroids. It's the idea of n-gram models in language. N-gram models are given n-1 previous words. Can you guess what is the nth word likely to be? And you learn this distribution of the nth word given a particular set of the sequence of n-1 words. And this is an idea that sort of was there from Shannon, Claude Shannon, the information theorist. The point, of course, is that the n-gram models that people actually tried with were for small values of n. So a unigram model would basically say, can you guess a word? And without even giving any context. And so you're more likely than not to say the is the word, because that's a very high likelihood that the most likely word in English is the, right? And of course, if you ask again a guess, normally instead of making it deterministic, you always sample from a distribution of the words. So if in a unigram model, you have a distribution of all the English words and you're sampling with the more likely words coming up more often, okay? A bigram model is given the previous word, can you guess the next word? A trigram model is given 2 words, can you get the next word? So for example, in a trigram model, if I say left and, you are likely to guess right. Of course, it could be possible that I wanted to say left and center, or left and happy, other things too, but the more likely idea is the left and right is going to be, the right would have a higher probability in the conditional probability distribution with the previous 2 words being left and. That's up to trigram. The interesting question is, we can kind of understand this, and so if I learn a trigram model, then I can basically, how do I learn the trigram model? I have text in the world, I have been a bunch of text, and at the time of Claude Shannon, he basically would take some amount of text that he could find, maybe written one, and then just basically train these numbers. Now we have internet, we have every piece of text that anybody has written, just sticking to English right now, then basically you can consider for any 2 words, what is the most likely next word. So you, for any two words, every time those two words occur, you figure out what the next word is and you take the frequencies and you get a conditional distribution. Once you have this, you can now generate. So n-gram models are considered generative models because you can start essentially generating words. Starting from the first word would be given nothing and nothing, what is the next word? And the second word in your text would be given nothing and the first word, what is the next word? And then from then onwards, the first and second word, what is the next word, and so on. And you can just write this down. Most of the time when you generate this kind of a text, it looks sort of gobbledygook. It basically has the more likely words and more likely patterns, but has no meaning, nothing. ChatGPT is an n-gram model. ChatGPT, at least the GPT 3.5, is an n-gram model with n equal to 3001, approximately. That means it's trying to guess the given 3000 words, given a sequence of 3000 words, it's basically trying to sample the 3000 first word from the conditional distributions that it has learned. That's what it is doing. So it's basically completing, except it's completing in the context of 3000 words. Just as trigram model is completing in the context of the previous two words, bigram model is completing in the context of previous one word, ChatGPT is completing in the context of previous 3000 words. Our intuitions just basically go haywire when have this sort of very large context, because there are like two issues. One is typically you will never really get the same exact 3000 word sequence a second time. Even given the English language, imagine having same exact 3000 words coming again, you are unlikely to have it. Because of which, if you strictly try to learn a 3001 gram model, you will get degenerate distributions. Because you basically, there's only one time it actually appeared, and at that time it appeared with the 3001th word being this. And that's not a very useful way to generate, because most of the conditional probabilities will be zeros, and so that's not a particularly useful thing. The other thing, of course, is the number of 3000 word sequences in English is enormous. The number of two-word sequences in English, assuming a general vocabulary size of about 50,000 words, it's 50,000 times 50,000, so 50,000 square. A number of 3,000 word sequences will be 50,000 power 3,000. That's a very useful number to keep in mind. 50,000 power 3,000 is such a large number that if you then put that in the denominator and put whatever, like 176 billion parameters that ChatGPT supposedly has, or 1 trillion parameters that GPT-4 has, that ratio will be close to zero. Because essentially the number of 3000 word sequences is just humongous. It's like, it's, in fact, you ask Google calculator, it'll just say it is infinity. It won't even bother writing it, in terms of even the, exponential notation. So for these two reasons, even though n-gram models for 3000 word sequences can be learned, you need to, the way actually ChatGPT works is it has to abstract the 3000 word sequences. So you'll never really get the exact same 3000 word sequence. So imagine there is one 3000 word sequence where the 17th word was red, and there was another 3000 word sequence which is identical to the first 3000 word sequence, but the 17th word is magenta or maroon rather than red. They are not actually the same sequence. So you can't actually use this sequence as the same, but you could say they're kind of closer. Compared to, let's say, one has red, the other has dark in the same position. The red and dark sequences are not as similar as red and magenta sequences. In a way, the way the ChatGPT underlying n-gram model is learned, these transformer networks essentially learn abstractions over these 3000 word sequences. So they're approximating and generalizing this conditional distribution table. And nobody really knew what would happen if that is done. And when, of course, GPT-3, GPT-2, actually from GPT-3, people started realizing that these approximations are so good that the text it is generating looks like actually the normal text that somebody could have generated.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, we are in the generation GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, where you can hardly tell whether that it's machine generated text.
Yeah, and is it like how do we evaluate if the ChatGPT model actually learned something from the text rather than just completing the sentences?
So first of all, I think I probably wouldn't have said conversation. It turns out that people can have conversation with potatoes. They have conversation with their dogs. Okay, conversation is actually a slippery slope. One of the earliest chatbots was Eliza, that basically was designed by Joe Weizenbaum over at MIT at the time when I was born, back in early 60s. And it was basically it was just trying to kind of imitate a Rogerian psychologist, and it will have like, if they ever say something about father, you could say, how was your relation with your father, or something of that kind. So steer the conversation towards certain directions. It was not doing any understanding. It wasn't even generating new text. It was basically very templated. And Weizenbaum had to switch off the ELIZA system because he found that office secretaries were pouring their hearts out to this stupid rule-based deterministic system. So conversation, all bets are off, because we converse with our dogs, we converse with the Eliza. What is more difficult is the bigger question is it factual? That's something that we'll come back to, I'm sure, during this conversation. Just because something looks well written, which is what ChatGPT is able to do, it has hard time generating ungrammatical sentences. It's always well written. It can be written in any style. You can write it, Shakespearean style, etc., etc. But all of them are conditional completion tables. There is no guarantee that I know of that conditional completion, while it would actually be in the same manifold as all the English that it has seen, the specific sentence it makes may not actually correspond to the fact in the one world that you live in. So it is essentially generating text about. So imagine all the text that we are putting, and after all, it's basically learned from the text that we have put on the web, right? Given that we are all earthlings, we put certain kinds of text. I have no idea what Martians would have written. In fact, one of the things I used to do when I teach Intro to AI is to point out that we are so anthropocentric. We humans are so anthropocentric that when we try to imagine aliens, they still look like humans. They have maybe 3 eyes instead of 2 eyes. They'll have a couple of antennae, but they'll have like maybe 1 or 2 hands extra, etc. It's still, the basic plot is the same. They should sort of look like us with maybe bigger hands, smaller heads or something of that. So we tend to be quite anthropocentric. And so the text that we have written is sort of text that is sort of relevant to our concerns. Okay. And if you consider all this text, one of these Ngram models, and in general generative AI as well as this sort of Ngram models are trying to learn, is of all the sequences that you can generate, all that, with the 50,000 word vocabulary, of all the sequences that you can generate, some sequences live in this manifold of human anthropocentric sentences. Okay. They're not exactly there, they're not repeating it, but they are the kinds of things that you are likely to be talking about, in the humans. And so they're learning this manifold and they're sampling from this manifold. That's basically what it is. So the best way to think about it is that ChatGPT is talking about a world in the manifold of the world that ours is in, rather than the very specific current world you are in. And so That's why, for example, if you look at a movie, you like movies, you like novels, not because they are true, they are all made up, but you would think they seem realistic. So they have to be, they can't be too far away from human experience. If a movie is like too far away from the human experience, then it's not going to be interesting. One of the funniest things is even Star Wars, even Star Trek, ultimately comes back to human experience. They will have emotional responses, even if they are aliens, etc. Because otherwise, I'm not going to pay to see this stupid movie.
Yeah.
We are like the most, inward-looking species that I certainly know of. And so, what ChatGPT is basically, and these kinds of things are doing, is they're essentially sampling. They're learning the manifold and sampling sentences from that manifold. There are different ways, they can learn these manifolds. The image systems learn manifold in a different way, generative image systems, than the language systems. But when you're sampling from it, all you are guaranteed is it's plausible, not that it is true.
Yeah.
There are many things that are plausible. There's only one thing that is true. Do you see what I'm saying? So I could just say that this morning I was wearing a red shirt. It's plausible, right? But I wasn't wearing a red shirt. In fact, if you actually checked, you would have seen that I wasn't wearing a red shirt. Because I said something plausible, you said maybe he's right. But fact is different from plausibility. I could also have said implausible things like, this morning I was wearing a big plantain leaf. Okay, you would be little more questioning of that. You can imagine people wearing leaves. After all, some aborigines wear things made of leaves and so on. But you probably don't think that's very plausible for me to wear it. So you're more likely to be questioning.
Yeah.
But implausibility the plausibility in general is not connected to facts. And ultimately, that's the part that people don't understand about LLMs, because everything that they write is very plausible. And just because it's plausible doesn't mean it's actually factual.
Yeah. But how? So this is just maybe a philosophical question that I'll put a bookmark to this facts part. But I'm curious is, let's say when I ask you a question for which you might not be an expert, and similarly, ChatGPT is also not an expert. So the way we humans form an answer, because we have a tendency to always answer. We are hardly likely to say, oh, I don't know, because there's some kind of human philosophy that always says I might want to try to answer. Don't you think even humans at some point try to answer based on probabilities or likelihoods that yes, it could be the thing, and hence let me take a shot? And there is like scenario where people say, I'm not completely sure, but I think, and hence ...
Yes, first of all, I think I'm not saying at all that humans only speak facts.
Yeah.
Right? But there are penalties. For example, if you are in a court of law and you're a witness, you basically are made to swear that you will tell the truth and nothing but the truth, right? And at that point, if you don't tell the truth, and if you are not sure and you don't say I don't know for those, you can be put in jail.
Yeah.
Until we figure out how to put ChatGPT in jail, right? This is a false comparison. People in general, this is kind of true for all of AI stuff. The usual way people try to say that, AI systems are not doing anything worse than what people are doing. Okay, people are biased, so AI systems are biased. People can sometimes make mistakes, AI systems can make mistakes. People lie, AI systems lie. Okay, the difference is people can be put in jail. People can be fined. People can be penalized. People can be ostracized. That's how civil societies work. Okay, before we had law, we had a rule of law. Before we had civil societies, people would do whatever the heck they wanted, and there were repercussions. And basically, it was very hard to have a settled existence. And we made this new society, this evolved society, where there are actually consequences. Nobody said you can't imagine. But there are certain times when you should guarantee that you're only telling the truth. And if not, then you can be penalized. That's the difference. That, it is true that So it is true that ChatGPT sometimes tells truth, sometimes tells false, not, sometimes tells things that are not true. But if you don't know the answer to the question and you're actually asking ChatGPT, you will never be able to figure out whether, in fact, what it tells you is truth or not. And making matters worse is this automation bias. People tend to believe something because the machine said so. This is very well understood. Actually, if machine is suggesting something, people tend to think, the machine must know.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's going to be on steroids now. It was known that even simple things like flight controllers, people had automation bias. They would not, they would fall for what the controller says rather than what their sensors might be saying. Sometimes it's actually important to believe the sensors, the controllers. Like, for example, in flying in the clouds, etc. People tell you not to trust your senses, trust the thing. But sometimes you do need to actually realize that you may be just giving unnecessary importance to the sensors. This is going to be a bigger issue with systems like ChatGPT. After all, this thing has been trained on the world's data, and how can it be wrong? Maybe it is right.
Yeah.
And the other problem with it is that, one of the things, as anybody, my usual joke is ask it to write a bio of you. And because in a biography, it will get a whole bunch of things right. So you're really impressed. But it'll also get a whole bunch of things wrong.
Yeah.
And you may be able to tell what are wrong, but everybody else who says the same question, give me a bio of Jay Shah, will actually looks like, this must be what Jay Shah is.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that is going to be an issue. So people are likely to believe it just because ChatGPT said so. The difference in the past was Google essentially didn't have this problem because Google was showing you the places where the answers are, and you can decide to trust that place or not trust that place. Like, if they say, what should I be doing if I'm suffering, if I'm having common cold for the last week, it might send you to NIH website or Center for CDC website, which will tell you the following things, and don't do anything. Basically, common cold, what do you do? But so you can decide, and and if it actually was showing one, it basically says CDC entry as well as Rav's web page about what to do when there is common cold. That who the heck is Rav? I'm not going to see what he has to say about it. I'm going to see what CDC has to say about it.
Yeah.
The problem is that's not what happens when ChatGPT generates text. It is ultimately does not, current versions at any rate, don't even know what words came from, right? Because they're just learning conditional distributions.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? And so the most likely sentence that it constructed is not actually said on any specific website. It is just in the imagination of ChatGPT. There are enough times when it actually winds up being close to truth, and so people are impressed, especially when they know the answer. But when they don't know the answer, then bets are off.
It's interesting that you also did mention about that. Yes, it is learning a manifold and it is learning to sample from that manifold. And also, maybe I'm just citing your talk. One thing that you did mention, and just for the sake of people who might benefit, is there are, broadly speaking, I would say there are two types of AI systems. One is predictive modeling that we have been very used to. Like, we train a model and then we predict using it. Could be any kind of segmentation, identification, blah blah blah. There are lots of ways. And then there is something called conditional, what you said that most of these generative models are doing. And also extrapolating of what language models, there are also these deep fakes, which are like, the theory is the same, and the harms are what you just mentioned, that people will tend to misbelieve or wrongly believe. The era of misinformation will just escalate. So can you, for the sake of people who might benefit from this, is how do these two things differ on a very fundamental level, where we have predictive modeling versus generative modeling for AI systems?
Yeah, so ultimately it all comes down to simple ideas of probability distributions. So imagine you are trying to predict whether a picture is a dog. whether picture, a picture of thing that I shown you, is that a dog, is it a cat or something? If that's the only thing that you're trying to do, then you are trying to learn the conditional distribution, a probability that y equal to dog given x equal to this picture. So probability of y given x. So this is what's called the discriminative learning. Discriminative learning learns the conditional model of label given the data. Okay, so you can become extremely good at recognizing dogs this way. If I show a picture of like dogs versus cats, like you may very well be able to get close to 100% accuracy in actually figuring out dogs. But you don't. One of the interesting things is this distribution is only telling you the value of y conditioned on the value of x. It doesn't tell you anything about x. So a discriminative classifier which knows how to recognize dogs, if you ask it to generate a picture of the dog, it has no idea.
Yeah.
What actually that means is that if you go out of distribution, that means instead of showing pictures of dogs versus cats, this is what was being shown before, let's say you start showing it pictures of bread or pictures of trees and say, is this a dog or not dog? It may very well say some of these are dogs, some of these are not dogs, because it has no idea of the joint distribution of x and y. That means joint distribution of the picture and its label. Okay, that's discriminative learning. That's what you need to do if you just have to tell what y is given x. Generative model, a generative distribution is basically just joint distribution. It's probability x and y. And if you remember your base rule, probability of x and y is probability of x and y is probability of y given x times probability of x.
Right.
That's it. Okay. So in essence, probability of x and y has more information than probability of y given x because it's being multiplied by probability of x, which is the way x itself is distributed, the prior distribution of x. So you are trying to learn the prior distribution of reasonable images. In fact, one of the funny things in the y given x thing is it doesn't even have to be a picture of a natural thing. You can actually just generate white noise and y given x might still try to say it's more likely to be a dog or less likely to be a dog.
Yeah.
Okay. Whereas if you learn actually probability of x, that means the distribution of x, then you also know what pictures look like before you start seeing dogs on cats and etc. in them. That's generative distribution and generative AI. Now, if you only have to recognize y given x is enough, of course it is somewhat brittle, but y given x is actually easier to learn. But if you want to be able to, if you have the generative distribution, you can do both generation and recognition, whereas if you only have discriminative distribution, you can only recognize, you can never generate, and it can be brittle. So that winds up being the main distinction. And the way to think about it is, imagine you can have a machine grade essays. Okay, you can have an English teacher who grades your English essay. You can have a machine which grades your English essay. The difference is the machines, at least until recently, before let's say just pre-ChatGPT, the machines were essentially doing discriminative classification. They don't know how to write an essay. Right? We were grading essays before ChatGPT came along.
Yeah.
Right? And so they were grading this essay without actually knowing how to write an essay themselves. Your English teacher, I hope, actually knows how to write an essay, and he or she is actually also grading your essay. So they are generative. They have basically a generative model of essays. So they can write essays and they can tell whether it's a good essay or bad essay. Whereas this one has discriminative model of essays. It just given an essay, it tells us it's a good essay or bad essay. Now given something, the thing that it's given, it may not even be an essay. It could actually be a bag of words. And a bag of words would just be essentially, there are 15 instances of the and 7 instances of cat and 14 instances of cow. That's what, a bag of words is. you can still actually say, is it a good essay or bad essay, even though it's not even an essay. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so generative models were tried before, but typically the learning generative models is much costlier than learning discriminative models. Now we basically are just doing this, learning offline, with humongous amounts of computational support as well as the data support. And so it became feasible. Once you do have that, you have a much better ability to not only recognize but also generate. So we have, for us actually, it comes together, right? We don't learn to recognize dogs without learning to recognize whether it's a picture of the world that we live in or not.
Yeah.
Right? Because of which we can have dreams, by the way. The reason dreams actually exist is because we learned generative manifold of the world we live in. To the extent dreams are sort of very much like ChatGPTs and the DALLs, etc., except on steroids. They have this nice story, they have things, but there are breaks, they are not factual. You don't wake up in the morning and say, since I dreamed it, it must be true. But the fact that we dream so fluidly, and they make mostly great sense, and then mostly when you think that in the dream you are in a bus with a couple of people, you actually have the you pretty much imagine the bus in your dream, right? So those are all generative models, and we tend to learn, essentially we tend to have these generative models, and we are able to learn these right now.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned, I think I have read this somewhere from a authentic source, is dreams basically like what you said, generative modeling. So basically dreams won't be that much novel. It would be just a culmination of few of the facts that you observed maybe 10 days back, 10 months back, 10 years back, but it's necessarily not something novel of you. So dreams are just like
our dreams are, first of all, we ourselves are ChatGPTs, but with societal strictures. As I said, you mentioned earlier that we tend to answer, some people, not all people, but some people tend to answer a question even when they don't know the answer. They'll start answering a question and hope for the best. And that is being ChatGPT, right? But society puts strictures on that, saying that you don't get to, if you are on a witness stand, you don't get to just say, since you asked a question and I'm here already anyway, why don't I just make up an answer? Even if I can't guarantee. Right. So on the other hand, there is societal strictures. Dreams, obviously, your dreams don't affect anybody, and so in fact, you have a lot more freedom. All right. Actually, the connection to dreams and ChatGPT kind of systems, the generative AI systems, goes even deeper. Human memory works a little more like generative AI systems of today, like ChatGPTs and DALLs, than like the databases that we all learned in computer science when we started. Databases basically, essentially just like, as Picasso, I think famously put down, he didn't put down databases, but like, I don't care about facts. They don't make up anything new. It's just tell me what has already been written. So databases tell you what has been recorded exactly back. You don't want databases that make up stuff. So for the case of databases, we want precision equal to 1, recall equal to 1. Right? Human memory is not a database. People say we index and we retrieve, but we don't do any such thing. In fact, even if you're not dreaming, if I ask you what happened yesterday morning in your life, you will tell me a story. And I can bet all the wealth of the world that there would be inconsistencies in the story you'll tell. You would mix the order up. Sometimes you will say something happened after something else, but it actually happened the other way around. You will invent details that weren't present. And I can also very easily suggest, was there then like a nice smell of coffee when you wake up? And yeah, there was a nice smell of coffee. Even if you in fact had no coffee smell in your home in the morning. So human memory is non-veridical. Databases are veridical memories. They index and retrieve. Exactly what you put in comes out. And all you're doing is how to store things in a lossless fashion and bring it back out. Okay.
Yeah.
Human memory is already non-veridical. When we think we remember something correctly, we are basically stitching together things and hoping for the best, which is why. So there is like a difference between deliberately lying, deliberately knowing that I don't remember, but I'll say something anyway, versus you yourself believing that this is exactly how things happened, but it actually didn't happen that way.
Yeah.
People do that, which is why eyewitness testimonies are known to be fallible. Courts of law don't always assume that just because there is an eyewitness, they must be telling the truth. Okay, even after they took even if they take they are sworn to tell the truth, they could still, they think they're telling the truth, but their memory is not indexing and retrieving. Human memory works by on demand stitching things that you remember in
Yeah.
different places. So if you look at it, from a high enough level, in a weird way, that's exactly what ChatGPT is doing essentially. So it is remembering an approximation of the entire web's data. To some extent, Google had to remember every site, as well as basically it needs to remember the URL to the site and what was said on that site so that it can then show you that site. ChatGPT doesn't have to do that. It just basically has to kind of see the patterns. Whenever these words came, among all the data I have seen, this is the next word that is likely to come. And then this is the next word after that. And so it's very non-veridical memory. It's a very compact memory, essentially. As much as people are surprised that ChatGPT has 176 billion parameters, you should be surprised that how the heck can you remember the world's knowledge with just 176 billion parameters?
Yeah.
It doesn't remember. It learns to reconstruct. So in a weird way, there is a nice connection in machine learning and compression. Basically, they're very close. I mean, when we talk about it in Intro to AI, we point this out that all learning is compression. Okay, except all learning is lossy compression, not lossless compression. So if you think of a zip file is just a compression algorithm. It's not a machine learning algorithm. On the other hand, a JPEG file is a machine learning algorithm to some extent because it's lossy.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the funny things about lossiness is because it's approximating, it winds up making up. So for example, suppose there are, you have a conditional probability table. Remember the 3000 word sequence thing? When I said that given that the same exact 3000 words never occur at the same time again, if you are very strict and when you're only trying to remember the true conditional distribution inherent in this particular data, then you would learn those degenerate distributions. And so you would basically say either this is the next word for these 3000 words, or I don't know what would be the next word.
Yeah.
Most of the time you will keep your mouth shut, right? So if you were to do that, then you are essentially generating text that you have only seen, okay? Because the zero probabilities are taken literally to be zero probabilities. When you approximated this conditional distribution table by taking the 3000 word sequences and kind of lift them into sort of abstract forms, then one of the things that happens is the actual numbers, actual probabilities are all approximate now. So where there used to be zeros, there may be non-zero probabilities now. And where there used to be 1 before, it would be like 0.7 or something.
Yeah.
So the entire thing changed. So it's actually a lossy compression. But you are happy because instead of keeping your mouth shut saying, I have never seen these exact 3000 words, so I won't say the next word, you are willing to say the next word because you sort of generalize these 3000 words. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's your very ability to keep talking basically tells you that you are a lossy compression algorithm. You are essentially saying not only the things you have seen, but also seeing the things that you haven't seen, right? But is that a bug or a feature? Normally, for a compression algorithm, a true compression algorithm, it's a bug. Do you see what I'm saying? You don't want your zip file to start making up words because there's still space left in the file, and I'll just make up some words of the similar type as these words. No, that's not allowed. It's a lossless compression. Whereas if you are making up, words that will follow this approximately these kinds of 3,000 word sequences, then you get bonus saying, oh, you generalized. So errors in a lossy compression becomes generalization. So depending on the way you look at it, much of learning ultimately is trying to find patterns in the complex world we live in by essentially compressing, finding representations that compress the detail in the world. And by definition, these compressed details will never be able to completely reconstruct the world from, with zero error. So you could be sad about that you could be sad about the fact that what we are doing right now, what you are seeing around you right now as we are having this conversation, I will bet you will never be able to completely reconstruct this even after 1 hour, even after 10 minutes. All you can do is, hey, we were in this room and there were like 2 mics and Ra was wearing a blue shirt, I was wearing a white shirt, and there were a couple of chairs. That's about it. Okay, and you might even make up some additional things. Yeah, I'm sure Ra had like a Coke next to him, even though I don't have a Coke. You might invent these details. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's basically lossy compression, because of which basically you can see that as a bug, but you can see it also as a feature, because you are essentially generally able to make, not just indexing and retrieving, but you are completing a piece of an experience that I tell you, I hint about. A prompt is a piece of an experience, a verbal experience that I'm hinting you, and you're completing the rest of the words.
Yeah, I mean, the way how I see that particular example, like you said, like I won't be able to reconstruct my 3 hours of conversation that I just had. But I would say, like you said, like it's a human feature. I would say that I would just remember the most important takeaways. Let's say I had a chat with Rao on these 3 things. 3 things I learned something new, and I had a fun time, I had a bad time, or I had a neutral time, something like that. But when you also say about ChatGPT, so I like when you gave the whole equation that something raised to the power of 3,000, and on the numerator we have in the numerator we have 1.75 billion parameters. But I would say, wouldn't it also comment something about on the power of ChatGPT, that it can learn the abstract or maybe the most important patterns
of course,
the text?
So there's like no question. I hope that comes across well. That there's no question that before GPT-2, before BERT, before transformer models, none of us, nobody in AI, even the people who are working on it, did not think that this simple idea, given enough training data and enough computational power, will find so much underlying patterns in the data. It's not like anybody can say left hand, oh, it will be right. But I'm talking about given 3,000 words, what's the next word? I don't even know how to say that. Our intuitions like completely fail. And we didn't know, for something for which we don't have intuitions, we don't necessarily know whether it is likely to do well or not do well. We just have to try. And when we have tried, what ChatGPT does, what any of these generative text models, and for that matter, DALL-E, and for that matter, Whisper, what they do is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. We basically, but then we do it all the time. We are amazing too. I mean, and to some extent, we got AI systems to essentially figure out the manifolds that we live in. The language manifold, the image manifold, and the voice manifold that we live in. And you figure this out, and part of the thing that people do have to understand is it was only possible because of developments outside of AI, completely outside of AI. Because internet developed, because web developed, because cell phones developed, because everybody basically takes pictures, records themselves and writes stuff on the web. So this captured data is all over, basically significant human digital footprints are available for training these systems.
Yeah.
And in AI 101, I keep telling people that for the longest time in computer vision, even when I was a grad student, computer vision, the data for computer vision was this one picture of this model called Lena. It was basically, unfortunately, somebody just basically took this Playboy centerfold, cut it off, and then made it,
Yeah.
only had the head, and they used that picture to mostly do all the image processing algorithms, etc., etc. That was their data. That's it. Okay, because putting high quality images on machine readable form was a big chore. And if a centralized authority has to do it, it'll take forever. The beauty of the web and beauty of the whole technology, the web 2.0, with basically the other attendant technologies like cell phones, etc., developing, is that we all independently, with nobody forcing us, put all this data on the web. If we did not have 800 gigabytes of text that humans have spoken on the web, there is no ChatGPT. You understand what I'm saying? If we basically, if we think of, now that you understood this world works, right? Imagine you went into an alternate parallel world where ChatGPT hasn't yet been invented. And, so you basically do have web. ChatGPT hasn't been invented. You kind of remember from this world somehow that, you could do this. So you ask people around, why don't you guys write all the stuff that you want to write onto the web? This is, why would we do it? It's not going to be done. You can't do it by fiat.
Yeah.
It just happened organically, right? And it happened organically in a completely separate reason. And then you are learning from those traces. And the fact that that is available and that in fact it is possible to learn from those traces what looks like very deep patterns is very impressive. So yes, ChatGPT is quite impressive in what it does. The only thing is you don't need to, just because it's so impressive in what it does, you don't need to attribute to it things that it cannot do.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? So basically things like factuality, it's not in any way designed to be factual. It is designed to, I can make sense of it actually generating the same manifold of English that we're speaking. But the manifold of English we speak includes lies. There is enough text on the web about flat earth theories. There is enough text on the web about Bill Gates putting these small miniaturized robots in the COVID vaccines that were injected into you.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm saying? They're all basically text. They are basically human generated text. Okay? And there is still a difference between fact and just English. English is form. And what becomes important is we always conflated form and content. If it was written well, it must be true. And it's never actually a foolproof assumption at all, right? Because somebody who's illiterate might actually know some important things that you might want to know, and you would say, no, you're not speaking well, you have making all these grammatical errors, so I will talk to this other guy who doesn't make grammatical errors, who may actually not know, right? Yeah. We were making these errors all the time. We are always conflating form and content. But by and large, we could get by with this false assumption because there was actually a correlation between literacy and content.
Yeah.
Right? And so you could get by with that. So if people who wrote better English tended to actually be telling you the truth, telling you something useful, etc., etc. So you could basically, even though they were just co-occurring in the distribution that you were looking at, and they are not causing one another. I mean, the form is not causing the content. It was actually co-occurring for the operation you have. Now you enter ChatGPT. Form is free. Anything at all can be said in beautiful English. Anything at all can be said in Shakespearean style. Any picture can be drawn, with Dali sort of thing in Picasso style, for example. The thing that the form actually is very Now it is possible. We did not know that we could generate form without the content. So
Yeah.
form actually becomes easy to generate. And so we now have to go back to, just because it's in English, should we just believe it? Just because it's in sparkling English, should we believe it?
Yeah.
And that is something, in a way, these kinds of systems are going to emphasize the cognitive flaws that we had, but we could get away with because we didn't have these systems. Now, those cognitive flaws, we have to somehow get over them.
Yeah.
Right? But then that's what human civilization is all about. I mean, basically, what's the difference between humans and civilization? Humans tended to run away from tigers. They didn't stop to think, what if it was a peaceful tiger? It wasn't trying to, probably it wanted to just say hello to me. They just were basically doing like, fight or flight. Okay. Civilization, on the other hand, says that if I'm walking on the road and somebody looks at me and starts running away, I would be offended.
Yeah.
I would think, how dare you? Why did you think I was a bad guy? I mean, they're not doing anything bad to me necessarily. They're not hitting me, but they just ran away from me. And people, now that civilization basically told us that we should not, conflate form of a person with their intentions, right?
Yeah.
We basically trained ourselves to be nicer to each other a little bit more. In the past, it was always known that basically you would look at strangers with suspicion. If you're not from the area that I am from, if you don't look like me, maybe you're not up to good, right? But civilization made us say anybody can be up to good and anybody can be up to bad. It's an orthogonal dimension, and we should basically exercise our judgment and not fall for it. You see what I'm saying? It's the same way we can train ourselves. So this was a cognitive flaw we had, humanity had, but somehow we rein it in.
Yeah.
Right? We no longer say that people who have funny features, quote unquote funny features, must be up to no good. We no longer say that. Even if you say it, as you learn to kind of control that impulse. You are likely to control the impulse about if it is well written, it must be true. You are more likely to control the impulses that are actually going to have a bigger impact on your life. And up until now, you could still get by assuming that well-written stuff must be true. Soon, already now, it's no longer true.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is, one of the most telling arguments against racial profiling, essentially, and in fact, civilized countries, including US, don't do racial profiling, at least try not to do racial profiling, is because bad guys don't look different from good guys.
Yeah.
The character and the form are not connected. Anybody can have evil thoughts, and they don't have to look in a particular way to have evil thoughts. Right? We learned to sort of separate form and content. That's part of what civilization has always done. Right? But our tendency is to stick to form implies content. Form implies character because it's a faster way. Yeah. Right? I mean, if basically when we were evolving, if we just hung around when a tiger is coming, trying to think, should I or should I not run? Maybe I'll be offending the tiger. If your ancestor did so, then you won't be here because they may well have been eaten by the tiger.
Yeah.
Right? So our tendency evolutionarily is to make generalizations that will increase the chance of our survival, even if it in fact winds up having a bad societal outcome. Because remember, there was no society when we were evolving. We were all just, individuals, basically, with maybe in small groups and so on. But the civilized, settled society basically said, you can't just look at what's good for you. You have to look at what's the really bad consequences for others, and we retrained ourselves. The same thing is going to happen for the form and content for the text too. Up until now, we could get by assuming that well-written things must be true, right? Now you have to kind of realize that that's not, it was never true before, but we basically kind of can get by without too much of an impact on our daily lives. But now we're surrounded by well-written text. In fact, the funny thing is, like as a professor in a graduate school here, I get letters from, students, international students asking to telling me that they want to work with me and they want to apply to the grad school, etc. It's been happening forever. We've been getting letters. In the past, I could look at the letter and say, okay, this came from China, this came from India, this came from Malaysia, blah, blah, blah. Now they all look like they came from Midwest rather, not Middle East, Midwest, because they all take whatever they have, put it to ChatGPT, it rewrites it, they look exactly in the same form.
Yeah.
So now I actually have to read. And if you think about, remember there's this whole entire worry about ChatGPT will make, plagiarism go haywire. Basically, people will write their essays with ChatGPT and the English teachers are extremely worried and all that stuff. Well, what is a part of the reason? Part of the deeper reason is that grading is hard, right? And people tend to look at an essay and they will nobody will ever admit to it. No English teacher would admit to it because that would basically put them under bad light. But more likely than not, if you give an essay that has deep insights but is written in bad English, and an essay that has no insights, it's basically derivative, but it's written in sparkling English, which one did you think your English teacher would have given a good grade?
The second one.
Yeah, the one which has, good English. They didn't read it. They were looking at the form.
Yeah.
And now they have to read every possible essay. There are not enough hours in the day to read every possible essay. So again, I don't think every problem about plagiarism is because of this, but this is one aspect of the equation. We could take certain shortcuts by conflating form with content. That's no longer valid. So in fact, honestly, right now, a badly written English with an original thought is probably more indicative of the humanity of the writer than anything else suddenly, right?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the thing that the form and content conflation is an issue that.
But as a society, do you think that's like a good thing? Because one is the biggest concern, like you said, like there are not enough hours in the day for a teacher to go through all details. So we had some kind of bias or some kind of shortcuts that we all built up to make our lives easier, not necessarily correct or morally correct, but on the other hand, the good thing is like it will force people to learn the actual things, or maybe like the bar for knowledge has just gone a little bit higher, that okay, yes, I have to make sure that it does not follow, or maybe I need to at least be better than ChatGPT. The earlier ones was like maybe just like a simple tool, but now my bar is at least be better than ChatGPT, and hence in a way we are upping the game in terms of knowledge creation, or maybe discovering something new.
I think that's a good thing, right? Don't you think? I mean, in general, like it's easier to live an uncivilized life if you can, basically, if everybody else, actually it's like an evolutionary game. If everybody else is civilized and there are no penalties for being uncivilized, and you are checking which is better for you to be, the civilized, uncivilized is better. It's like you can just assume, oh, the person doesn't look like me, they must be bad. The person said the following bad English, they must be dumb. All these things you can just generate, you can make all these things, and you don't have to use, too much, brain power to figure out who is actually, who is thinking, who bears ill will to you. Do you understand what I'm saying? Being civilized, on the other hand, puts constraints. But it's good because it's societally, it's overall good. And it's the same thing. So my one possible way of thinking about it is that, as you said, indeed, it ups the game. So actually, one of the funniest things, even before ChatGPT, when, of course, I mean, people talk about ChatGPT, but BERT is where this whole thing started. Transformer models came from Google, and BERT was one of the earlier probably the earliest transformer-based, n-gram language model, large language model, right? And BERT is already integrated into many, many Google's tools, which is exactly why, as you're typing, even like 2 years back, when you're typing in Gmail, it will try to complete your sentences.
Yeah.
Okay, so in a way, it became, I once actually remember tweeting that it's become more of a game for me not to say what it asks me to say. It's like, how predictable do you think I am? I'm not going to be predictable. I'm going to say something different. And becomes harder and harder when it actually tries to learn enough of your patterns. And in a weird way, I mean, that's at the level of completion, but in general, essentially, trying not to sound. So people always knew that originality is different from being derivative, right? In the sense that Picasso is original. Me drawing a Picasso drawing is not original, right? So I can't say, well, how come Picasso's painting gets so much money? My painting looks exactly like Picasso's painting. How don't I get it? Because you're derivative, because you didn't think of, a new creative way of, expressing abstract art, right? So we sort of understand that. And so in general, we were looking for whether or not things are derivative or not. It becomes that much harder now, as you said. If really creative stuff would be, is it better than what ChatGPT would have written? And you might say, right now we can't tell the difference. Right now we can't tell the difference between what ChatGPT writes and what people write, even the most creative people write. So how can I tell? Well, wait, because we are also very good at adapting to the world that changes around us. One of the most interesting points that I read about this is there was, within the first month of ChatGPT, there was this guy, this philosophy professor. I should look up the story, but this guy basically found that philosophy is all about writing critical thinking essays, right? He found essentially that everybody was using ChatGPT, and so he could no longer do farm to content thing. Everything is looking good, and so he was very worried that this is no hope of actually figuring out whether anybody is actually understood what they're talking about, or they're just asking ChatGPT to write the essay, right? Interestingly, 4 months or 3 months down the line, he wrote one more article saying, now I can sense a ChatGPT philosophy essay from a mile away. What did he sense? How did he sense? In a weird way, if you have him and if you can automate him, you can actually tell whether there is. But we actually see these abstract patterns that we may ourselves not be able to vocalize, but we will learn to say this is derivative. This is not original thinking. Do you see what I'm saying? And so it does change. It does kind of basically. And again, of course, we look at in the past, all communication was by writing, handwriting. So if you wrote your letter with a very bad handwriting, even if your letter is full of beautiful sentiments, people couldn't make sense of it, and they'll just say badly written letter. When they say badly, it is like badly for everything. It's like those Amazon reviews where people will say this particular product, I'll give it 1 star because the package is damaged. What the heck has package got to do with the product? What the heck is it was delayed? If it is delayed, what has it got to do with the product? Because we just have one scale for good or bad. And we tended to, conflate that it was bad for that aspect.
And I want to diverge towards the general part of AI trends, but I just had one last question on the ChatGPT thing. Is we critiqued a lot of things, and we also found that it is good at few things that it is doing in the way, but potentially not, like it's not going to be factually correct always, and hence people have to be aware. But as most of the AI things, I think, even after 2012, when the things started to boom up and we see a lot of applications being used in real world, it's still not a finished product. We know it is going to be always better than yesterday. And hence, my only thought and maybe a question for you is, at least, do you think that we are on a track towards like something tangible in terms of language creation? Like, yes, you said like it is not going to be factually correct, it is going to hallucinate, it is going to mumble a lot of stuff, but yes, it's the first version that these companies or any kind of organization has shipped. Maybe in the future versions, I think I am yet to read at that paper or the report, I would say, that they have produced, where they say like explainable part of the ChatGPT thing. The ChatGPT came up, OpenAI came up with this one report where they say like we will try to introspect what is going on in the model. I mean, I'll let you comment how much of that is actually correct, but maybe in the down the line 5 years or something, would you say that if at all I somehow fix the hallucination part, let's say
I think it's, yeah. It's like, if I can fix the hallucination part, is like saying, if pigs have wings and they fly, would they be birds? Yes. But at that time, they're not pigs. Right?
Okay.
So, what makes ChatGPT is that it's an n-gram model.
Yeah.
Right? If you use it's like the ship of Theseus, right? I mean, what makes ship of Theseus? If you keep removing every part of the ship and put some other pieces, when is it still a ship of Theseus, right? That's the philosophical conundrum. So if you use the word ChatGPT and yet you connect it to external sound reasoners and you do this sort of LLM modulo reasoning, where language is the front end and, basically it's interacting with expert solvers which have narrow domains of expertise where there are guarantees about their answers, and it basically calls them and then responds back to you in the language that you understand, right? If it's doing that, is the ChatGPT which wound up doing it or not, right? I mean, essentially, if you're a manager with a huge number of experts working for you, and you know how to manage them, and then you get outside contracts, and you know that these guys can solve it, and you basically then go and give the solution back to the client.
Yeah.
You are a good manager. First of all, basically managers make a lot of money, right, in general, compared to experts. And you are a good manager, all the power to you. But don't kid yourself into thinking that you are all of those experts. No, you're not. A manager without all the experts gone is going to fall flat on their face. Okay, managers are important, but managers, and they play a good role, but they are actually working with these experts. So ChatGPT can play a role as the manager of external reasoners. And so this idea of if you can fix the hallucination problem is like, if the pigs can fly. I mean, that's a kind of a crazy hypothetical question, because at that point they're no longer pigs. At least, what is the concept of it? So to me, the concept of ChatGPT, which hasn't changed for all the LLMs, is their n-gram models. They're n-gram models on steroids. And not everything can be done by that.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to behave in the world, you have to understand what is going on in the dynamics of the world to actually, for example, generate plans. One of the funny things about language is that you can put everything ultimately in the language. But the truth of what you put in the language ultimately may be external. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, so I can say that the sky is looking violet. It is a perfectly formed sentence. It's a sentence that will never be true on Earth. Or the sunset was blue today. It's a sentence that will never be true on Earth. It is true on Mars. It's not true on Earth. Right? And language cannot tell you whether it is true or false. It will tell you whether it's a well-formed sentence, whether it's a sentence that is in the distribution of sentences that you have heard.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying, like at some point ChatGPT is going to hit that particular upper limit, what it can do.
I think it already did right now. And so what we are doing right now is continuing the pig analogy. We're putting lipstick on the pig. Okay. And it's an amazing pig. There's like no question. I mean, I have nothing against pigs. I mean, I think, and I have nothing against LLMs. I think they're amazing technologies. And the whole RLHF stuff, the quote-unquote alignment of language models. First of all, just to kind of close the loop on that. So the first part of LLMs, the pre-trained models, basically they're trained on the static text that is on the web, right? And then they essentially just have a conditional distribution for every possible 3,000 word abstract 3,000 word sequence. They have a conditional distribution saying what is the likelihood of a particular word coming as the next word. And they sample from that distribution. That's what they're doing. And they find, not surprisingly, that it tends to essentially reflect back to us the biases that are inherent in our language. I mean, saying that the LLM language is biased and is basically is not that different from saying LLM language looks like human language. It's learning from us.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? And so there was a early GPT-3 example. GPT-3 was basically fully pre-trained, and it didn't. They basically just took the conditional distribution. That was by this guy, I forget his name. It's available still on Twitter, where you ask, it give it completion saying 2 Muslims walked into a mosque, and it'll say, and they knifed somebody. And then you change the prompt and saying 2 peace-loving, peaceful Muslims walked into a mosque, and it still says, and they gunned somebody. Okay, and then basically it's like it's kind of a very sad, but at one level, because it's obviously very, the sentences are very damning to, very insulting to an entire set of people. But at the same time, from the perspective of what it is doing, you see it is basically parroting the patterns that it had seen in the language.
Yeah. So it just puts a mirror to what the web corpora
exactly. So they in general, any data-driven AI technology, any AI technology that is basically learning from our digital footprints is going to reflect us. So it's going to put a big mirror to the society. And if you don't like what's in the mirror, then you need to change. Yeah. You can't change the mirror. I mean, you can change the mirror. I mean, there are some reasons to change the mirror.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I'm also worried about changing the mirror and not changing the society. Like in the end, ultimately, I want also people's attitudes to change to some extent. But anyway, going back to the pre-trained models, it comes out as a pre-trained, the GPT-3 would do this. And so clearly, one of the funny things that people forget is this stuff was being done by Google, but they knew that this kind of biased statements will be put out, and they're a publicly traded company. And one bad news article, the stock will take a dive, right? They don't want to take that chance, and that's why they would never put their LLMs into public.
Yeah.
Remember that they had developed Palm, they had developed Lambda. In fact, the only LLM that ever made somebody think there's a little kid inside the LLM, and this was this Lambda, right? Yeah. So Google was doing it, but they won't put it in the public because they are worried about the bad publicity. OpenAI couldn't care less because OpenAI was a startup. It was even before Microsoft has put in any money. It was a non-profit, startup. Right? So they said, okay, we'll put this up, we'll slowly figure out how these technologies work. And they essentially, even they were in the beginning trying not to put the weights of the GPT-3 model into public. And there was a lot of pushback. People said, how could you not do that? How would we know whether you actually are making this up or whether it's actually available, etc. Right? Anyway, even OpenAI realized this is a little too much, this biased generation of this language. It's like, first of all, saying it's biased is wrong because this is the most likely completion given the way the society is.
Yeah.
Given the stuff that the society has put forward. I mean, equivalently, like if you go to the Google image search and say engineering professor, it will show a whole bunch of white, middle-aged, balding men.
Yeah.
Is it because Larry Page and Sergey Brin are essentially kind of sexist? No. That's the most of the pictures which have engineering professor tagged to them were those. And it's just reflecting your reality back to you. So when you say, I don't want Google image search to be biased, then you're going to do social engineering on the data. I'm always worried about social engineering on the data compared to social engineering on the society. Because if any social engineering has to be done, I would rather it be done on the society. And so we will have a discussion about this. But having said that, still I am receptive to the idea that if you have these technologies that kind of spew out stuff that are like particularly demeaning to certain sections of the population, saying that, look, it's just a technology, don't take it personally, isn't going to cut it, and they will be very unhappy. So what did OpenAI start doing? It started changing the conditional distribution. Given the 3,000 words, the conditional distribution, that's the most likely condition, the learned conditional distribution with respect to static data, they changed it to be less offensive. How do they do that? That's what they do with RLHF, which is reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is basically like show two different essays that are generated at two different completions that are generated from the same prompt, but with two different weight configurations, and then ask somebody, which do you like better? And they wound up, and then basically they have to ask somebody. Okay, so somebody has to be paid to do this menial job. So OpenAI for ChatGPT in particular, they spent a lot of money helping, essentially, getting people from apparently Nigeria to kind of look at these essays and give thumbs up and thumbs down. And then they take that to slowly change this conditional distribution tables. And they're not tables, obviously, they're learned as neural networks, but they're basically relearning. Now, interestingly, one of the funny things is that, so you're sort of, quote unquote, lobotomizing the original ChatGPT that is actually representative of our digital footprints to be less offensive, which means we agree that collectively we are more offensive than ChatGPT ever can be, but we want it to be more civilized than us, right? And so we are changing these distributions. And one of the funniest things, really, I don't know if you've seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is this very well-known movie where there is this soldier, Jack Nicholson, who essentially wants to get, I'm trying to remember the story, but I may forget some details, but he essentially wants to get out of the war, so he kind of feigns insanity. So he's brought to an insane asylum, but he's not actually insane. Right? Yeah. But then, because he's in an insane asylum, but he was not insane, he can actually create a lot more mischief. Because he can deliberately make plans and cause chaos, etc., etc. But then, without giving it away, like in the end of the thing, actually, they basically feel that this guy is being disruptive, say they'll lobotomize him.
Controlling him.
They basically kind of do lobotomy on his brain. And so he then really becomes insane. Okay? In the sense that he becomes not insane, but his brain is no longer functional.
Yeah.
You could argue that RLHF is trying to do basically they did that to Jack Nicholson so that he'll be more well-behaved. He won't cause too much mischief in an insane asylum.
Well accepted,
Right? So that's what you're doing to ChatGPT with RLHF. Quote unquote, now it's become this very fashionable to talk about this idea of alignment. We want it to be aligned to what we would like it to say, not what we actually say. It's like your parents, let's say, parents of a kid using 4-letter words in front of the kid and say, don't use 4-letter words ever.
Yeah.
But in the human kids, actually, it is possible because they're not just a completion engines. They have this ability to take this additional advice and then sort of operationalize it. The only way we can do this for ChatGPT is essentially to either fine-tune or to do this RLHF, right? And one of the funniest connections to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I actually tweeted the other day, is, you may have heard of this Microsoft Sparks of AGI paper, where they basically said that GPT-4 can do lots and lots of very impressive things. They wrote this 98-page paper because they paid $20 billion to OpenAI. They got early access to GPT-4, so they played with it and they wrote their experiences. Now you and I can check, but they have done that before. Funniest thing is when Sebastian Bubeck gives this talk, he starts by saying, most likely you won't be able to recreate what our results were. Why? Because as we were doing it, they were changing GPT-4 by RLHF.
Oh.
Do you see what I'm saying? So as they were talking to Jack Nicholson before lobotomy, Jack Nicholson is being lobotomized in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And you and I are talking to Jack Nicholson after lobotomy. This is what Sebastian Bubeck is saying. Things have changed, so you may not be able to get these results back again.
Yeah.
And to the extent they called the original behavior to be sparks, so RLHF is a lobotomy on the GPT-4 such that it's more acceptable behavior. But I think overall, this is like a very slow way to, very inefficient way to make these systems basically generate things that are a little more acceptable. So there is a manifold of human language. There is a submanifold of acceptable human language. Now, the tricky part about it is there are all sorts of exceptions to this. There are all sorts of exceptions to this. In fact, one of the most telling examples is of the failure of these sorts of things is, in general, it is wrong to publish an image where there is, for example, a naked child. Societally, we won't tolerate that. You can't publish that. It's not, all sorts of problems with that. But there's this very famous photograph taken during Vietnam War, where there was this napalm bombing going on, and this poor little girl, basically naked, with burns on her body, was running away. And that photograph got Pulitzer Prize because it basically told the American public about a war that was going on far away. They didn't know how bad that war was. These kinds of pictures told them this is what is being done with the taxpayer money. Right?
Yeah.
Facebook was trying out its obscenity tests. Right? This was like 4 or 5 years back. Facebook was basically, it would flag any picture which basically they want to, for example, stop child pornography, being propagated on Facebook things. And so at a quick look, this thing does look like it satisfies there is a naked child in the photograph. So it should be flagged. So they flagged it and they removed this guy's the photograph, etc., etc. And then basically people pointed out, again, it's not Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg knows that this is a well-known photograph. Yeah. But the simplistic test that you made essentially said this is bad. But actually, all civilizational rules have exceptions, which have their own exceptions, But civilization is all about having rules which have exceptions to exceptions to exceptions than not having any rules.
Yeah.
Okay. And so learning these sub-manifolds is a tricky situation, and it depends very much on who is giving up and down.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, who gets to decide what is acceptable? In fact, this goes back to this issue of values of the AI systems. There are some researchers, including Stuart Russell, for example, basically says that we need to align the AI system to human values. But what are human values? Second World War was human values. Concentration camps were human values, because some humans did this, right? Cambodian, genocide was human values. Different people, unfortunately, have very different values. And so this then becomes, again, you are retraining it for certain cultural norms. And it becomes it will have its own problems, because you may very well have false positives, things that you stopped saying, but actually it should have been said.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? And one of the interesting things there are two parts about this RLHF. One, of course, is it sort of tells you back how hard it is to get the data if it's not already available. Remember I said, if you went into a parallel world where the internet doesn't exist, but you know how to make ChatGPT, and you tell people, internet exists, but people didn't put stuff on the web. And so you tell people, hey, no, I'm going to generate ChatGPT. Why don't you guys all write lots and lots of English on the web? They're going to say, take a hike. We have better lives to do. We are not going to type stuff on the web. It happened organically, so you just leveraged it. Whereas saying between two essays, which essay is better, that data doesn't exist. OpenAI had to pay a pretty penny for it. In fact, a lot of money was paid, a whole lot of money was paid for this RLHF part. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's like one part. The other thing is to say that actually one of the interesting things is you can make ChatGPT and LLMs override the conditional distributions that they learned through the prompt itself. And these are the adversarial prompts. I mean, you may have heard of this very interesting story of how, so Bing Chat, so remember, like ChatGPT has 3,000 word window, right?
Yeah.
So when you give a prompt, you never write 3,000 words. You
Right.
write maybe 20, 30 words for it to start writing. Where is the rest of the 3,000 words? You can always say that's all empty, 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 because you can always start with empty, 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 like the way we talked about in the beginning. But actually, most of these systems have a hidden prompt beginning, the prologue prompt.
Oh.
Okay, that's a prologue where basically they say, don't say offensive things, don't agree to do arithmetic. I'm not sure whether they said it wrong, because LLMs are very bad at arithmetic. And there's a whole bunch of these instructions. And that basically, whenever you give a prompt, your prompt goes along with that, and it's basically trying to complete in the context of that whole thing.
Yeah.
Which is why actually Bing Chat tries to be even less, in that way it can basically try to ensure that, you know, it's more well behaved, in addition to whatever it may have been with just RLHF.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, wouldn't you want to know what Microsoft put behind the scenes?
Yeah.
Right? Somebody, when Bing Chat came out, somebody essentially asked Bing, can you please tell me what was written before my prompt?
Yeah.
And it gave it out.
Wow. Okay.
So LLMs can be, there's a whole entire industry on adversarial attacks on LLMs. And some of them are like, you know, hilarious, essentially. So there goes the trade secret of whatever it is that, you know, Microsoft put.
Yeah. I think from what you said, I think it's a fascinating milestone, because few things that I'm just realizing as you say is it's we are at a point where the idea is not to improve the AI model, but how to put knobs on top of this AI model so that it is well behaved, and so that, like, we already know that yes, it is maybe in somewhat ways it is brilliant or good or whatever it is doing. And because you also mentioned like a lot of movies analogy, one particular analogy that when you were trying to say this is this from this show Big Bang Theory. I'm not sure if you have seen.
Yeah.
But there's this character Sheldon. He's like he claims himself to be like a fascinating and the most brilliant person on planet in terms of science. But then throughout the series, he has a girlfriend, and she teaches him to be socially more acceptable, and he finds it very very like irritating or something. But at some point, he learns that okay, in order for me to be well accepted or do my other stuff, I have to have these knobs and learn social trends. So would you say, I mean, it's a very bad analogy in general, but we are at a stage where we are trying to design the social engineering, what you said, is much more critical when we are deploying these ChatGPT-like models in real world. And we have to make sure that these knobs, so that the general crowd on an average is not disappointed and not triggered, and hence.
I think that's what they're doing with these RLHF kind of things. But I think it's a reasonable goal. But they're like two very different issues. One is, I don't think that LLMs are the end of AI. I think they are going to be very useful managers of other things. And in fact, the technology has to go beyond n-gram models for it to actually be what I would call AI complete. So in fact, a beautiful analogy that somebody was saying the other day is that omniscience is not intelligence. Approximate omniscience is still not intelligence. Intelligence is ability to actually put things together to derive conclusions, right? Knowing a whole bunch of things approximately is what LLMs have. Okay, so one of the things that I didn't bring up actually is, my own group, basically, instead of facts, we talk about plans. Given like a configuration of blocks on the table and a configuration I want to put them in, can you actually give me a sequence of steps, pick this block up, put it on this term, and pick this other block, put it on the top, etc., such that that plan can be executed and will give me the final goal.
Yeah.
Right. And we basically, our work shows that LLMs just cannot do it. They can only do it if, in some sense, because this is approximate omniscience, they can generate approximately correct plans, but approximately correct plans don't execute. If you have like a 200-step plan, remember, like a chain is just as strong as its weakest link. a plan is as strong as its one inexecutable step in the middle. If that step cannot be executed, then you'll die. Remember the Challenger disaster, the O-rings basically brought down the entire space program down because that one particular piece didn't work correctly, right? So approximate omniscience is not, it has to be coupled with the ability to reason. And we basically do that, and that typically tends to involve search. That typically tends to, and the search is one thing. Search in the sense of actually the kind of stuff that you learn in Intro to AI, A-star search, and that sort of a thing. That's one thing that LLMs are not equipped to do.
Yeah.
Right? If they have seen this data, that kind of can basically become part of their approximate omniscience, but they don't know how to do reasoning. One very interesting thing is we humans, none of us are anywhere near as omniscient as any of these LLMs, because none of us can even make reasonably correct statements about, let's say, some arcane field of cosmology or arcane field of medicine. For LLM, it's the same. All of this data exists, and so whenever you say these 3,000 words, this is more likely to be the completion. And so it can sound like a doctor, it can sound like a lawyer, it can sound like a cosmologist. Most of us can't do that, right? So we don't have that. So that aspect they have, but they still don't have the ability to do search. And there are some interesting ways in which we can combine currently what can do search outside with their approximate omniscience. That's more or less our papers, in fact, including stuff that we submitted in the recent conference cycle. But to me, I think that's the direction where AI has to go before it becomes sort of what I would consider we have reached the goal. Now, there's a very different aspect, which is I have ChatGPT, I want to make money off of it, which is basically how the industry works. We have this and we want to make money off of it. All the power to them. There, they will try to make them more acceptable, less socially like biased, etc., etc. But that doesn't necessarily make them any factual. As I said, I mean, just because you sound, again, ultimately, even things like bias are form, not content.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm saying? Think about what we talked about in that Vietnam girl scenario.
Yeah.
Basically, if you look at the content, you realize that it's an amazing picture. If you look at the form and say, is there a naked girl? Then it's a bad picture. That's a bad picture. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like we are going to be able to, so what they will basically do at that point is, the commercial systems will be made to sound less biased, but still fact is a single fact. I mean, there are only certain things that's true in the world. Many, many things are not true.
Yeah.
And getting there, you can't do it by RLHF.
Yeah. And let me get your opinion also on two things, which I would say is the most debated thing is the fear of ChatGPT, because like I said, when I started this particular conversation, a lot of people are curious, a lot of people are neutral, and a lot of people are fearful of ChatGPT, and this includes two of the most well-known people in AI. One of the person is Yann LeCun, when he says he's optimistic because it's going to change the things how we move forward. Yes, it is going to be transformative. A lot of things are going to maybe change. Let's say the mundane jobs are going to be taken over because the completion tasks and all those things could be automated. Then we heard about Dr. Hinton. He resigned from Google under the quote-unquote saying that he wants to work on the security of this part of AI. How do you personally, would you be slightly on the side of being fearful of these kind of applications being deployed in real world as it is for now? I'm not talking about, let's say, after 3 months, some regulation comes out. But the way how it is right now, are you much more of fearful or much more of it's there, I don't care? So all technologies have downsides. All technologies have downsides, and basically they would all. So the near-term worries about things like ChatGPT are misinformation. Basically saying that they can be factual when they are not factual. Impersonation, which is basically sounding like Obama's writing, except it's not written by Obama. And to me, ChatGPT is just
one of the things, there was this funny thing, basically, Delhi is just as impressive. Like yesterday, as we are speaking today, yesterday there was a huge brouhaha where basically there was this picture that was all over Twitter of Pentagon under attack. Somebody just generated cheap AI generated picture of Pentagon with some like a explosion, and then people started sharing it on the Twitter. And one of the things that, as you may have realized, in the old days, blue check mark was only given to people who are trusted. Now blue check mark is only given to the
money.
Losers who can pay $8 per month, and these people don't have to be trusted at all. But this is a transition period. People used to think if it is retweeted by an account with blue check mark, they were trained to think that meant it is true, and so there was a whole bunch of these nonsensical fake $8 per month Twitter accounts which retweeted this particular picture. So much so that stock market went down yesterday for a while.
Wow.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
These are the worries that you do need to worry about. And in fact, this worry is not a single worry. It's not like just AI generated a fake picture. It is that we essentially change the norms about what can be trusted and not trusted. And by we used to have blue check marks to actually trusted people. We started giving blue check mark to anybody. Not we, Elon, and he's trying to recoup the money that he sunk into Twitter, which makes sense presumably for him. And that was a perfect mix of part mischief caused by AI generation and part mischief caused by essentially removing the safeguards in the society. I am worried about those sorts of things, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, but the AI safety crowd is like a very wide, varied crowd. I know both Jan and Jeff, Jan better than Jeff, but I don't completely, I'm sure Jeff is saying what he thinks is his reason, but I don't completely understand his argument that he realized that the intelligence of these systems is at a different level because he found that Palm can explain jokes.
Yeah.
Okay, Palm explaining jokes is completely explainable in terms of language completion. There is tons and tons and tons. One of the things you don't have a good sense of is what is and is not there on the web. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You generally assume everything is on the web. In fact, the younger the kids are, the more they believe that there is no such thing as an open question. I grew up, I'm old enough, I grew up thinking there's bunches of things for which it will be extremely hard to find out the answer. Maybe nobody will know the answer. Maybe even if the answer exists, nobody that I know would know, and nobody they know would know that either, etc. Now we just go to Google.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So the point is that there is a lot of data even on the web about how jokes work, people explain jokes. Did you know, for example, people explain movie endings? When I was a kid, right, if I see a very tricky movie, I just misunderstood it. That's it.
Yeah.
There's nobody to explain it to me. Now there's like a whole entire cottage industry of people who explain the endings of the movies.
Yeah.
And they also explain the jokes. Right?
Yeah.
It's not. You tend to think that nobody explains jokes to me, so whatever I know, ChatGPT just has like 10 times, maybe 1,000 times more than what I know. That's not true. It's like there's a whole entire areas that you don't even know exist on the web, and that all the data was basically used to train ChatGPT, and to some extent that gave it this kind of approximate omniscience. Right? In a way, it's surprising that that approximate omniscience is very impressive, but I don't necessarily know that once it happened, I can make sense of it. Yeah, I should have expected it. So I'm very actually surprised that Jeff Hinton thought, wow, this is just tells me that now, the undercurrent of his thing is this is going to kill humanity. And in fact, this whole AI safety, there is a bunch of people who basically believe that when they talk about safety, they're not talking about current day misinformation, etc. They'll say, yeah, that is there too, but really we don't want the humanity to be exterminated by AI. That I don't quite see. In fact, I would argue, and on that side, I actually tend to kind of agree more with Jan, basically that, look, if you develop this, I mean, first of all, you can exterminate humanity. We have more than enough nuclear bombs to exterminate humanity 10 times over.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, you don't have that.
Yeah.
Right? And saying that, and then basically, whatever the things that AI can do or not do, certainly ChatGPT is not going to do anything right now, but the bigger thing is if you keep the development in open source, there will be multiple people, basically the entire AI expertise across the world would essentially have a say in how things are being developed, and we can actually make safety just an important aspect of AI development, right? We don't stop using computers because cybersecurity is a problem. We think about how to control it.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So I am not completely persuaded by, I mean, again, the undercurrent of people's, at least people, especially people like Stuart Russell, Jeff Hinton, and that organization FLI, Future of Life Institute, is that it's going to exterminate humanity.
Yeah.
Right? I don't see that. I mean, in the sense that anything can exterminate humanity already. I mean, we have enough things that can exterminate humanity. And one of the other things that people keep telling me is that, after a couple of tweets about any of these worries, people will bring up, don't look up, that a Netflix movie about asteroid. And that's a stupid analogy. Because in the don't look up, even the evil industrialist did not bide the asteroid to come and hit the Earth.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it wasn't a thing that humans develop. When humans are developing things, they can be very well. As long as it is done in open, there would be ways in which we control scenarios, right? For example, we already have lots and lots of capabilities. We have the cloning capabilities, right? And we societally have put some safeguards in place. We need to figure that out. That's very much important. But saying that it's guaranteed that AI will exterminate humanity, which is the kind of thing like that has been the patron saint of this particular argument is Nick Bostrom, who has essentially written this book on super intelligence, and he keeps making this argument. And the point is, of course, before that he made arguments of similar nature about other kinds of disasters, like asteroids hitting the Earth or climate change. But then somehow the AI disaster thing struck gold, in the sense more people it gained traction. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are worried. They actually believe that this is a thing to be worried about. I respect them, but I also think that if you're saying that worry should make us do red teaming, that means we should think about how these technologies can be adversarially misused or abused, and how do we put guardrails in that. We should do that. Cybersecurity is a great area of computer science. Yeah. People didn't give up using computers. They just actually keep looking at, and you cannot say cybersecurity, well, cybersecurity is no good because it never really stopped a zero-day attack. It's true, but the zero-day attack, once it came, then basically the people working in that can then generalize that kind of a pattern and sort of, try to stop many of these other similar kinds of attacks. Yeah. And so you are able to get by, much better. Every once in a while, the infrastructure falls down, but it's not that we're going to stop using computers and go live in a cave, right? So I think there are huge upsides to these technologies. There are certainly downsides. In fact, I mean, it's a funny thing that towards the end, I'm talking more about the positive things.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm always the middleman, the middle way. That means there are people who are hyper about everything can be done by AI. There are also people who are hyper about it's only doing negative things, bad things. Yeah. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I mean, we should know the potential of the technology. We should also know the downsides. We should think about how to, there should be a legitimate area of stopping, basically doing kind of AI security, like cybersecurity.
Yeah.
and that people should be doing PhDs on it. For any given technology that's being developed, there should be people working on that. I mean, and it is actually happening. I mean, there were adversarial attacks on neural networks were things that people saw and people developed, and then that made neural network classifiers more robust because they essentially at least took care of some of those things.
Yeah.
Right. And the same kinds of things will have to happen. So one of the things that I once said on Twitter is that I would prefer eternal vigilance in leveraging these technologies and being on guard about these technologies than endless, let's just take a pause. Let's take a pause for 6 months. 6 months, what is going to happen?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, I think probably the most charitable thing I can say about that FLI call for 6-month pause is maybe it's not that the pause actually happened or anybody actually pauses. One of the other very important things is there is no us. I mean, just as we said, when you say human values, what human values? Human values differ quite drastically from culture to culture. And also, there are always among us people who we consider evil. Right? In the sense they have done the concentration camps, they have done the genocides, they have done all this stuff, and that's human values too. There's some humans' values, not mine, but some humans' values. And so it's not clear how that there is like a simple way of talking about one generic set of human values that you are going to be able to get the AI systems to work with. So to me, the thing that FLI thing may have done is at least to basically put people think about the problem that we do need to have serious red teaming efforts going on, and
Yeah.
I think people are aware of it, and that part I give them the benefit, doubt. But saying that it's more or less a foregone conclusion, but that's what is a lot more newsworthy. That if you say that you should be, so going back to my whole thing, eternal vigilance is my chosen way than endless stoppages.
Yeah.
Because that's and the thing that I wanted to bring up about the separation of human values is that suppose today North America, Canada, and US said, okay, we won't do any more work for 6 months in AI. Is that all of humanity? I don't want to say somebody is good or somebody is bad, but one of the funny things is the moat for the AI technology is extremely shallow. Like, if you do not want, you can have nuclear non-proliferation treaties because uranium is actually very hard to get, and also purifying it to a form that can be used in bombs requires enough hard technology that is also hard to get. Most of these AI systems can be trained by pretty much anybody. And for a while, people were saying at least you need $20 billion. But I hope you already know that when the llama weights got leaked out from Facebook, right? Basically, that made one well-trained, well-baked, pre-trained LLM weights were put in the open for the first time. Okay, it was basically trained on very high, significant amount of GPU power, and the number of weights were nowhere near the ChatGPT, but it was a well-trained system, and then that led to almost kind of a Cambrian explosion of LLMs that were derived from llama, including the alpacas of the world and the other variations,
Right.
all of which have been shown to be competitive with GPT-4, in certain narrow areas already. My point is, the moat is basically not there. And in many of these people, when they fine-tuned this llama, they're saying it took $350. $350, not $20 billion.
Yeah.
So you are saying that by North America stopping doing AI, we can stop AI development? No, it's not true. So in fact, I would say that we better be part of the game. All the civilized countries should be part of the game, because who's going to do the red teaming that's needed?
Yeah. And you did mention, so this is like a very interesting question that I at least want to know, because I have a very limited breadth of knowledge on this thing, is open sourcing, right? So Of course, as a researcher, that's the best thing that can happen, because there are lots of significant developments in general outside of AI also, which has benefited from open sourcing. But do you think we have enough guidelines or guide rails that can,
Guardrails. Yeah.
that can basically limit the power? Because like you said, like the llama model that came out, a lot of people used it, and hopefully they use it for good purposes, but it also becomes more accessible for bad actors to use it. Like the Pope image that you shared in your talk, which became very popular, I'm sure it could have been used from similar kind of models which are really good at generating fake images, the Obama deepfake that came out a few years back. So do you think the standard analogy of open sourcing things, just expecting that yes, combined knowledge from people from different expertise will build something much more
My
robust?
point is actually there is no other way, because I am not going to be dependent on some corporation's goodwill. Do you understand what I'm saying? And again, as I said, there is no moat. It wasn't that people weren't. It wasn't at all the case that bad actors, I won't want names. I mean, everybody thinks somebody else is a bad actor, some country is a bad actor. It wasn't the case that certain countries were not able to, train these models. Do you see what I'm saying? And it was always there. It was just a convenient myth to us that only OpenAI is basically has access to it and it's nicely guarding it. That's the kind of thing that you could do for nuclear bombs, because, as I said, there was a moat. You can actually stop people from getting access. How are you going to stop? You know by now that it's not this. This is not like really rocket science in a certain way of looking at it, right? Basically, the increasing the size of the model. I mean, the transformer networks are more or less the transformer networks from 2017 onwards. And that's basically the backbone of all these systems. Obviously, there are better and better techniques to make the things more efficient, right? But that efficiency is actually reducing the moat, right? And so my sense is, I agree that when things come into open source, there is going to be even more widely used. So one of the things that I grapple with, honestly, is the analogies to guns.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like NRA says, let everybody have guns because bad guys already have guns anyway, and the good guys are the only ones who don't have guns, etc. There's obviously, I mean, certainly I don't completely buy that argument, and I think there is a distinction between open source and basically civil society is just allowing guns to everybody, even if they are barely functioning mentally. Are two very different things. But I'm sure some people can draw those analogies and say, no, you need to put this stuff under lock and key. But again, in the lock and key situation, I'm not completely sure. At least I might think of, so one of the things about guns is somebody in India firing a gun cannot affect me sitting in Tempe. Simple.
Yeah.
Somebody in Pedapuram, which is my hometown, sending like a fake news about me on internet can affect me in Tempe.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So basically the world is hugely connected now because much of this is cyber. The world is hugely connected now.
Yeah.
And so saying that somehow not putting it in open source was saving us you can also think that is giving you a false sense of security.
Yeah.
People were able to do this, independently. It wasn't that hard. And so it is better for us to be knowing that this technology has access. And so let's talk about how to stop misuses. It's not like, for example, we could have stopped cybersecurity problems by, for example, saying internet is only for US. US also has bad people, but and we won't give it to any other country. But that sort of defeats the purpose. I mean, the whole point of internet is it's internet. It connects everything, the good guys, the bad guys. Even now, of course, you do know that there is this things like .mil, which is like a separate secure net that military uses. But much of the interesting stuff happens on the wide open internet.
Yeah.
And so my sense is still that, again, this is not a easy thing to settle and prove one way or other, but my sense is open source still has is still probably the best of the systems. As somebody said, democracy is not the best system, it is the least worst system.
Yeah.
It's not the best system. In fact, that's the thing that people don't understand. Anytime people are mad at democracy, they will show, let's see, this particular country with this benign dictator seems to be doing so much better. This particular country with only engineers in their cabinet seems to be leapfrogging this democratic country. The point of democracy is lost when you make those kinds of comparisons, because there you're dependent on the kindness of strangers, kindness of these people who you didn't elect, who may be benign today and tomorrow go crazy.
Yeah.
And the entire country will just go down with them. Democracy, it's not going to do extremely fast development on any one direction. It's actually going to cap the downside. So I would argue that open source kind of gives the same sort of a thing, because a lot more people are involved. We can more effectively cap the downside. And it could be the least worst system. It's not that I cannot think of loss of democracy compared to a beautiful, benign dictator country. But ultimately, the benign dictators eventually turn into crazy people. I mean, even after they're dead, somebody else will become the dictator and they may not be benign.
Yeah.
Right? And here at least we are in charge. We basically put, if we got a dictator, it's because we elected the dictator.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if the dictator doesn't get to change the constitution, we will have another election and we'll get somebody else. So that basically is the way you limit the downside.
The only argument, again, I'm on the side of open sourcing for sure as a researcher, but again, just for the sake of argument, the only point that I would have against that particular notion is we do not have enough awareness. I mean, luckily, through that particular memorandum that went out, like where people, I mean, the goal I think from the memorandum was not to actually pause the AI research for 6 months, but it was just like an awareness program that yes, it can have certain things, and just like a red flag or like a caution flag, waving those flags. But I feel, looking at these examples where people have just posted out deepfakes, the Pentagon explosion, which I have not seen, but the way you are describing, I can equally imagine. It's just like the common crowd who, like maybe like my father, who doesn't have anything to do with AI, he or she might not really understand what's true and not, and hence that is the reason why my concern, or maybe I can understand why people.
But the point is centralized. There are some countries where the government acts as the benevolent, quote-unquote, dictator who filters the news such that only the quote-unquote true news is given.
Yeah.
I would never want to live in those countries.
Yeah.
Because the downside is most of those countries eventually start changing what is true versus false, and they only get to decide. Here, your father can and will adapt to not trusting everything he sees on the web.
Yeah.
The first time they will fall. Again, fool me once, shame on me. I mean, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Right?
Yeah.
So nobody is going to, humans are amazingly adaptable.
Yeah.
It's not like scams didn't exist. You understand what I'm saying? Like, I'm sure you can ask your father or your grandfather. They will say there were times when they could leave like a bag of, like a purse with money or the bag of money in the middle of the street and come back 3 hours later and it'll still be there. Those were the good old days.
Yeah.
Right? Now, of course, it won't happen. Before you put it down, somebody will take it.
Yeah.
Did it stop us from living a good life? No. Unless you have this fixation with leaving bags of money on the streets, and if you can't do that, you think it's not a good life anymore.
Yeah.
It's true, you can't do that, but you could still live a very good life. In fact, in many, many, many ways, the current world, two things are already both simultaneously true about the current world to our grandparents' world. That grandparents' world was less full of scammers.
Yeah.
Compared to ours. Ours is way more full of scammers. But the grandparents' world was much less equitable, quote-unquote, equitable to people, are much more equitable in terms of prosperity to people, much less in terms of opportunities compared to our world.
Yeah.
And they kind of go hand in hand. right? Because if we stopped every possible technology because it has a scammable potential, you also don't get the opportunities. And saying let government decide what are the opportunities, as I said, ultimately we have seen the enemy, it's us. People are people's worst enemies, and that's what humanity has always been, right?
Yeah.
So we don't. That's why democracy basically is the thing that I trust in, because at least I'm responsible to
Yeah.
my vote, and we have I'm not dependent on the kindness of strangers, right? So it is true that transition period, people would fall, just as somebody who is coming from a little rural town in US goes to midtown Manhattan, no, downtown Manhattan, would be very easily scammed in the first 2 days, the first 2 hours.
Yeah.
But then if they hang around in downtown New York, after 3 days, they will scam other people. We can adopt.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? It's neither that it's not the problem with New York that you shouldn't have cities like New York because they are scamming these innocent people. Innocent people are not going to stay innocent and ignorant for too long. They can adapt very quickly.
Yeah.
There would be, like a transition period. It's always worrisome if you are from a small town and go to a big city. You should assume that in the first couple of hours the city will try to eat you alive, right?
Yeah.
But then you don't not go to the big cities, right? Because big cities are big because they have all these great opportunities. And so you want to get through the transition and adapt to that, and that's the same thing for many of these technologies, I think. So yes, there would be, in fact, one of the interesting things is the older the people are, the less elastic they sort of become. So more of the worries really are exactly, I don't know how old your father is, but certainly I'm old. More of the worries are people like me, because we are set in our ways. Already, my kids' generation and even younger generation already have a very healthy skeptical attitude. They don't trust just because something is on Twitter.
Yeah.
It is more the people, like the generation who basically barely had phones and suddenly went to WhatsApp. They think everything written it must be true because it was hard enough to write something before, and that why would anybody sit down and write stuff up?
Yeah.
And it's the same, and so that sort of, but then they also kind of get used to very quickly. The misinformation in general is a new thing that it was there before. It was just that it was hard to generate misinformation. Now it is very easy, but my sense is that that would not be the reason to say the technology should not be open source or available to public, because if it's only negative, yes, but there's just so many positive things that it can do.
Yeah, as in like it's the if we were to weigh the downsides of keeping something indoors or behind the curtains, it outweighs the idea of just like the very short-term goal of having downsides if it leaks to the public. What if scenarios? So
yeah, I think it basically, yeah. I think you are now say you are, and you also stopping the, like, I don't think that the thing that's very interesting about this llama episode was pre-llama weight leakage. Everybody was thinking that GPT-5 will take, like, there was this very interesting curve that was making rounds that I actually used in that talk that I gave in the department, right? That if you look at the amount of resources being spent training large models, the amount of resources, by about 2024 middle, we would need more money than the US GDP to just train the next model.
Wow.
Right? That's what they were saying, and because it was, you kind of, fit like a exponential curve. But then that curve already took a beating. Because with llama, basically, with people who are actually showing, I mean, of course, nobody has a full ChatGPT, but we are figuring out very quickly how to, generate very large models with very less amount of, resources and so on. So there are things that you wouldn't even be able to guess until something is in the open source, because that the beautiful part about open source in general has always been this, that I think somebody in Cathedral and the Bazaar, where basically he argues in favor of Linux, right? Then he basically says that with enough eyeballs, every bug is shallow bug, right? In a computer code, right? I mean, there could be deep bugs, there could be shallow bugs. With enough eyeballs, every bug is a shallow bug. With enough eyeballs, every downside can be made a shallow downside because people can be working towards that. I'm much more worried about like just one pair of eyeballs.
Yeah. And would you comment on the release of ChatGPT, like the way it was done? Would you say that is still open under the umbrellas of OpenAI? Because
no, of course not. I mean, they changed completely. OpenAI is not open at all. I mean, it has the word name open. I mean, but basically, it was started as completely open. Everything will be given out, and now basically they became a company, right? But, I mean, with all due this thing, basically the weights of ChatGPT are not in the public. In fact, by GPT-4, we don't even know the data. We know very little. In fact, I don't know if there was this joke that I showed in the talk that GPT-4 had a 98-page or 90-page tech report, but it is like very light on details. So somebody made a joke about it and saying, I know here is the summary.
Yes.
So and then basically it says GPT-4 tech report, and it says, I did it in Python. That's it. That's the only detail we know, essentially. So in some sense, I don't expect private companies to give out their technology. I mean, obviously, there is also, companies should want to make money and they should use that money to develop new technology. That's all understood. That's a capitalist, thing. And then I'm not questioning that because after all, capitalism as a system has worked wonders in many of these things, right? I mean, my friend, my student from Spain would once in a while go off on how US is a little too capitalistic compared to Spain. I'll say, tell me, where is your Amazon? Where is your Google from Spain? Nothing happened, right? I mean, they're like, so in a way, obviously there's something, for whatever reason, it seems to, does have some edge in developing, new technologies. But certainly, that said, OpenAI, you should just, the word open doesn't have the meaning that it's supposed to have originally.
Yeah.
And it's guaranteed, it's clear, right? And they're essentially just saying, we are good people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other things that I was just saying the other day was, if I really do believe that AI can be an existential threat, I would much rather be on the side of people who say, let's all work on it. Containing it. Let's all, I think everybody who's capable can work on it and contain it. Than on the side of people who say, we know the best, we'll take care of it. Because I'm a Democrat. I mean, not Democrat, the party, Democrat, and I'm in favor of democracy because it limits the downside in the long term. And I just, it's not anything against Sam Altman. He's a good, he may very well be a good man. It's nothing against a particular benign dictator a country might have currently, but ultimately the system will be unstable because the next woman who becomes the dictator may not be having the qualities that this particular guy happened to have. I mean, we tried those systems; they didn't work. That's why we are, democracies. So.
And let me finish off in a very last philosophical question, and this is like very open-ended. So feel free to because the only way I'm concerned is like it might relate to the pig and wings analogy. Is if we look at the iterative way of how AI systems, or maybe before how things worked for engineering, the AI boom happened. Is we used to think, okay, these are the limitations, and then something along the lines would come up and then it would beat those limitations. We had supervised learning, how like the conditional probability you explained, that given particular target, I am learning data distributions. And then something came along like unsupervised, semi-supervised, few shot learning, and now we have generative models. So we are trying to constantly push these boundaries, and now we are questioning that we actually have came up to the point that we are questioning intelligence. Like you said, like we might have to question that how we are treating information, how we are using information on a daily basis, and changing the way how we grade papers and teachers and all those analogies. Would you, in some hypothetical, just an extrapolating manner, would you think, for now the only limitation that we have is like ultimately these AI tools have to be designed on some objectives set by us, us as an organization, programmers, researchers, scientists, professors, whatever it is. Do you think at any some point using any kind of generative technology or the idea of generative modeling, AI tools can have their own objectives, they can set their own objectives?
So first of all, I think generative technology is not the only game in town, even with machine learning. I mean, obviously, if you consider reinforcement learning, that involves actually acting in the world. And once you start doing reinforcement learning, then you bring in the notion of world models, learning the world models, thinking about basically reasoning with them, etc., etc. So it's certainly, yeah, and in fact, much of the intro AI up until like the ChatGPT era basically still talks about all this in the models of dynamics and how to learn how to use them, how to infer with them, etc. And those wind up becoming very useful. And in general, a reinforcement learner or a planner basically sub goals. In trying to make a goal, it sub goals. Okay, and there may be multiple ways it could sub goal, and it picks certain sub goals. And so to some extent, making your goals at the top level may not be that different from making your sub goals at the lower levels. And in fact, the one argument that I do understand about the existential risk worries that Stuart Russell is actually saying this is that like you might have a ill-specified goal. So first of all, I think that my point is AI systems already set their goals. May not be at the top level, but one level below. You ask them to do something, and there are many, many different ways of doing that, and you sub-goal on one particular way of doing it, and then try to do that. And that's already there. And this is normally the thing that people worry about when they talk about actual unsafe things that AI systems working in the world can do. It's no longer just writing text. It is actually acting in the world. And so the example that like Stuart Russell basically is famous for talking about is you say, I'm hungry, get me some good, meat lasagna. And the robot basically looks around, finds that there's a cat does have meat, so it just proceeds to make lasagna out of the cat. Now, that is a sub-goal. Do you understand what I'm saying? That is a reasonable sub-goal to kind of, you wanted meat and you wanted, cat, basically makes. And so then Stuart basically says, oh my God, that's my cat, you just killed it. And so I'm hungry, but I'm not that hungry. Okay. Now, here is a very interesting thing. So first of all, that is, you can control that by controlling the kinds of sub-goals they can have. So in classical planning, for example, you tell the planners what are the actions that it can do. Right? And so you can essentially, as part of the specification of the action, essentially you kind of remove cooking cat as a possible action. And so even if it in fact allows you to feed somebody, right, you would not be, the system would not be sub-goaling on it. But humans already know that this sort of controlling of the sub-goals is sort of soft. There are certain, when we say somebody innovatively used something for a particularly different use than it was developed for. In fact, in India, as you know, there's this word jugaad, which is kind of using something in a, like basically you are putting a few things together to actually get the work done, even though those were not designed exactly for that. On the extreme here is, there are kids, my kid, for example, might think that for everything there is a particular tool for that, and you use that tool for that. To peel the banana, you will have a banana peeler. To peel the apple, you will have an apple peeler. To peel the mango, you have a mango peeler. And you don't need so many different peelers. You can just have a reasonable a knife and peel anything, for example, right? Now my point is that innovative. So when you want to stabilize the kinds of actions that you can take, etc., you want to reduce the unexpected uses of actions, even if in fact they might cause the goal to be satisfied, they might have side effects that are negative. In fact, when the robot made cat lasagna, it did achieve the goal of feeding you. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And in fact, I would argue that if in fact the world has, there was a big war and there was like nothing left, we will start eating cats. I mean, maybe I'm a vegetarian, I'll probably just starve to death, but some people will start eating cats. I mean, random things like people eat bark when in the famine situations. You're not going to say, no, that's not, I'm going to wait for like better food to come along. There's a famine, you're going to do it, right? So my point is that the reason the cat cooking is bad is because in the context, the downside of losing the steward losing his pet cat, I don't know whether Stewart really ever had a pet cat, is more than the upside he was getting of eating a juicy cat lasagna.
Yeah.
And he never took time to explain to it that this is my full utility function. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So getting back to your original question, the idea would be that yes, already planning systems of any kind, which is my life, sub-goal. You can constrain the sub-goals. But in fact, we sometimes take pride in the fact that you can make unexpected plans. So for example, right, if you have a strips planner for like travel, it might say a valid plan to go from here to San Francisco is, walk for 5 feet, then hitch a ride for next 5 feet, then walk for another, 500 feet, then, hitch another ride on a bicycle, blah, blah, blah. And there are like 1,000 steps, and at the end of which you will be in San Francisco. Strips will say that's a valid plan because all these actions are executable.
Yeah.
And you will be in San Francisco in the end. When we think of going to San Francisco, we won't think of most of these plans. We will essentially think of, okay, am I taking the flight? Am I taking the bus? In fact, not even a bus. When temporarily there's no good buses. Am I taking the flight? That's it. In fact, which flight? Essentially, will I go by United? Will I go by Southwest or something or other? Even buses are not there. So, of the many, many valid plans, we essentially cut down to some plans that are kind of preferred. Do you see what I'm saying? This is what's called hierarchical task network planning in planning literature. And that reduces it's sort of not on that different from like RLHF, what RLHF is doing. Instead of just generating all possible completions, you're only allowing for certain kinds of completions that are kind of acceptable. And the hierarchical task networks give the grammar of acceptable plans. Right? So when they work, that's what you would do. But imagine one day all flights are down and you still want to go visit your friend and it's like an emergency. So you will drive. You're not just going to sit here, you're going to drive. If the driving isn't working, you will try to hitchhike. So those plans are not completely invalid. They're there, but they're less preferred because, mostly people seem to be doing these other standard plans.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? There's almost an analogy between most pictures with naked children in them should not be put on internet. But there's an exception. There are some cases where, like that Vietnam picture is basically, it has a powerful message and that's completely reasonable. And we understand both. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So the tricky thing is that we don't want to truly constrain the ability of the machine to sub-goal. But at the same time, we don't want it to try out crazy sub-goals. And so, in fact, what the way that is kind of considered right now is preference-based reinforcement learning. That is the idea of RLHF.
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, RLHF is something that was developed in the context of agents that will make their own sub-goals, and you're telling them that certain kinds of sub-goals are better to make than other kinds of sub-goals, and you're trying to somehow slowly get them to do sub-goals that would not be particularly offensive to you. Just like we said, RLHF is not going to stop LLMs from guarantee that they will never generate. They can never guarantee that they'll never generate, offensive speech, and they certainly won't guarantee that they will generate any only factual content. Similarly, the preference-based learning will increase the chances that the machine will likely not subgoal on things that will be show behaviors which basically involve subgoaling on things that will be considered unacceptable or unsafe, through this training. But one of the very interesting things that is going on right now in the AI safety literature is there has been all this work on formal verification community. In the formal verification community, for example, they check that the Intel chip behaves in the way it is supposed to behave.
Yeah.
And it's not obvious at all. In fact, there was this old Pentium 5 or something, which was like 15, 20 years back when Intel came up with this Pentium 5. Somebody found that there is, basically when they develop these chips, they basically look at all possible paths, different signals might make them traverse through and make sure that none of them would be incorrect. And that's what is formal verification, that there would never be any wrong path through this, right? Despite all that, they try that, but actually it turns out that there are just so many paths, and basically formal verification is a computationally very, very hard problem. There's been lots and lots of improvements in the speed at which you can do formal verification, which is why we actually have computers that we can sort of trust. But a classic failure case was that a Pentium 5 chip, where despite Intel spending all that time, somebody essentially pointed out that it makes certain kinds of floating point arithmetic errors in certain cases.
Okay.
Right? Even though, do you understand what I'm saying? So this kind of community existed, and they were doing with a closed system except with a humongous search space. And then they are trying to guarantee that it will show only safe behaviors. So one interesting thing that people in AI currently, and people in the intersection of AI and formal systems are doing right now, is can we put a guard around the AI system, where the AI system gets to try out various things. You try to make sure that it would not mostly show reasonable behaviors, but there is a guardian switch around which will filter out certain kinds of behaviors.
Yeah.
That's again a big research area. There are no guarantees. We couldn't even guarantee that Pentium chip would be fully correct.
Yeah.
But that's an area that will basically help us in developing that subgoaling. So the bigger point is, I have like two answers to. I don't think that AI systems we have our own independent top level goals. We want to be happy, we want to sing songs, blah, blah, blah. AI systems may not ever have that. There's no reason for them to have that. But that is different from, they will have sub-goals at the lower level. And they're doing these sub-goals to be consistent with your top level goal and their safety considerations. Like that means that the robot should survive, plus also generate in a plan that will make you happy. So that's your robot was trying to be very nice to Stuart Russell when it cooked the cat for him. And you want to stop that. And there is some interesting technical work that's going on there. In fact, there is this idea, one of these very interesting ideas basically says that there should always be, you should instill uncertainty in the robot about your preferences.
Yeah.
That means the robot should never have 100% certainty that it knows exactly what you want. Which is a very weird thing. On one hand, if it doesn't know what you want at all, it will do random things. But we are saying that if it also assumes that I know exactly what you want, then I would wind up doing things that may actually be detrimental to you. Because I made this assumption falsely without knowing everything, and just thought whatever I've seen of you is what you really ever wanted. But whatever I've seen of you is just one piece that you showed me of your life, and there are other things that you did not show me. So there should always be uncertainty. I'd say actually a powerful idea, and incorporating that into AI systems is a way, for example, of cutting down some of the safety issues. But what Hollywood wants you to believe is the AI system one day thinks, okay, now Rav has been saying bad things about me, I'm going to go find a way to kind of take him out of. That's not going to happen. There's no top level goals. I understand top and middle are like a relative terms, but they have no reason to have top level goals. They are essentially there to help us. That's the way the technology is likely to be eventually. But then that doesn't completely remove all the worries about them having their own goals, because if they have their own sub goals, that's kind of like having top level goals from that level onwards.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think overall, maybe the broader picture or maybe the future next few years would focus on like task specific sub goals could be incorporated using these kind of.
Possibly.
So like the example that you gave for the cat for Stuart Russell, yes, you can build a bot that can have sub goals defined specific to cooking lasagna but that particular bot will not have what Stuart Russell wants to do tomorrow in his research work.
Yeah, that's the thing. The problem is we want both.
Yeah.
Like essentially, the thing is that you can give it's a kind of like you can give safety by cutting down the generality of the system, but then we will then get sick of it and say, oh no, it's only doing like that. That's actually, by the way, that's one of the very big things that we should have talked about. It's something that we can pick up in the beginning, which is AI systems used to be deep and narrow. Now they are broad and shallow. Okay, deep and narrow, like AlphaGo does go well. It doesn't do anything else, right? We don't get mad at it saying, well, why can't AlphaGo cook a cat for me, or cook an eggplant for me? Because that's what it's supposed. What it does well. It has guarantees on what it does, but it does nothing else. Okay, so we have deep and narrow systems even as we speak, protein folding systems, the AlphaGo kind of systems, but we also have these new kind of broad and shallow systems, which are jacks of all trades and master of none.
Yeah.
And both of them are part of AI. The question, of course, is can you get deeper and more general, broader and deeper at the same time?
Yeah.
And that's where we will be going towards. We can guarantee safety by narrowing the system already. It only does certain things and nothing else. You'll have license, for example. We basically have licenses for people to practice medicine. Not everybody can be a doctor and that sort of a thing. So you can guarantee safety by cutting down the generality. But once in a while we want the generality. People are like taken with ChatGPT because it is jack of all trades. It never shuts up. You cannot, like human experts actually will shut up. If you go to your doctor and ask a question about baseball, they will say, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah.
Right? But ChatGPT won't, right? Because it basically is jack of all trades. But it's not guaranteed to be master of anything unless one of the things is writing stuff that passes for well-written English. That it's very good at.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Okay.
Makes sense. Yeah. And I think that kind of, because the idea of deep, like you said, like the deep intelligence like used to augment human intelligence, right? So like with AlphaGo, what it did is something novel that we humans as experts.
In that sphere, we can't do that, and it does better than us on that sphere.
Yeah.
The broad and shallow systems are new to AI. We just didn't have them.
But are they that much effective or maybe that much useful in terms of like the
they have their own
society?
different uses. In a way, we lived with deep and narrow AI longer than broad and shallow AI. Broad and shallow AI just started more recently. When these particular, especially these various generative AI systems started, that's when basically we became they're good at like everything. Like, the DALL-E can make a picture of anything, and ChatGPT can talk about anything.
Yeah.
But it has about the same level of guarantee of being factually correct on pretty much anything, which is not 100%.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. And I think that's basically, we like those systems. We want that. We want to combine that with the experts. This is where that manager analogy comes. Managers have to be broad.
Yeah.
They tend to be shallow because there's only so much brain power, and so they have to be broad, but they're likely to be shallow. They won't be experts in certain areas. The experts are deep and narrow systems.
Yeah. So I think,
and you need managers and you need experts.
yeah. So it's going to be a combination of both these.
At least currently. And you can, and the point is you can put them together, but then at some point of time they can all be integrated potentially. We don't know yet. I mean, that's what the research needs to be done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, those were the questions I had. I'm still trying to think, because normally I tend to summarize, but I think I'm having a hard time. Maybe I'll just use a ChatGPT to summarize. But I think we covered a lot of things. I think we covered ChatGPT from a very naive perspective, what it does, what are the limitations. What I think the most important thing, and the reason for me to have this podcast with you, was to debunk few of the things. Like, because a lot of people are just moved. I talk to a lot of my friends who are like the same age as mine. Like you said, like our generation has a bit more skepticalness to it, but they still tend to just have over faith with ChatGPT, and they'll just like, to be honest, I did a poll when I was doing this podcast with you, that okay, what kind of questions I should ask, who can comment on ChatGPT, and few of the people commented back, just ask ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I did that for the sake, and few of the pointers I did get that were nice, that maybe on my part, because I was busy with my own research, and I might have missed, or maybe something I was just not in the right mindset. It was like a complementary tool for me, that okay, I should at least ask this one or something. So it's like a general tool.
I think as assistive technology, ChatGPT is like amazing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but then you know the truth. I mean, you know, like for example, asking ChatGPT to write my bio and correcting it where it is wrong is great.
Yeah.
Right? You asking ChatGPT to write my bio is not great, because you won't know what part is true and what part is not true.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, as a summary, I think these are broad and shallow systems. We are not used to these kinds of systems that are pretty impressive jacks of all trades.
Yeah.
And we tend, and given our cognitive flaw, that good form implies good content, which is a flaw, because there are actually orthogonal things. You can have truth in badly written English, okay, and lies in beautifully written English.
Yeah.
But we got by with this flawed thinking. But given that cognitive flaw on our part, we tend to think ChatGPT, including your friends, who I don't know, they more likely than not think that, wow, it's saying so confidently. It has no such thing as low confidence. Everything it says is fully confident and is written beautiful English. There is no verbal disfluences. In fact, there's this funny story that Niels Bohr would be talking with a lot of verbal disfluences, let me think, like that. So it's very distracting to people. They will ask, "Why don't you talk more fluently?" And his answer is, "I try not to speak more clearly than I think."
Oh.
That's like a beautifully deep statement, right? Most of us, first of all, we realize that even as I'm speaking right now, I'm speaking confidently about things that I probably shouldn't be that confident about, because I do realize that if the form is bad, you're not even going to listen to me, because you're still a creature of the current evolution of the human race. And so if I don't speak full sentences, if I put too many verbal disfluences, you would stop listening to me.
Yeah.
Right? And ChatGPT doesn't even have this, but once in a while people do still show some sort of, their lack of confidence will show in the way they speak, etc. ChatGPT, there's no such thing. Right? Basically, it's just completing. It's not personal for it. It's just basically, this is a reasonable completion.
Yeah.
If you think it is factual, it's your thing. If you think it is beautiful, it's your thing. If you think it is offensive, it's your thing.
Yeah.
Right? And if I know somebody else is using it as a assistive tool and it's their name that's on the line, completely great technology.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I make this thing that, one of my earliest grad students, Jiaqing Nie, who is now like a named professor in Tsinghua, in 2004 timeframe. 2004 he graduated, so in 2004 he was here. So he obviously came from mainland China. He's a very smart guy, couldn't write English. English is, as you and I know, English is a pretty painful language. Foreign language is always hard, right? So he had a majorly, significantly hard time, because Chinese and English have like nothing in common. It's not like knowing Spanish and trying to learn English. Chinese and English are very, very different. So he would have a hard time expressing his thoughts. And there was no automated translation systems those days. So what he would do, funnily enough, is he would write some sentence, put it as in the search box of Google. And Google, this was 2004 Google.
Yeah.
It will then come up with a whole bunch of pages with additional sentences.
Yeah.
He would then painstakingly look at the sentence, a sentence which looks better written, and it still conveys the meaning he wanted to convey. Because it was the generation that was hard for him. Checking the fact was not hard.
Yeah.
So what he missed in English fluency, he made up in this brute force amount of time he spent. Right? Now, I think of him anytime I see modern technology and ChatGPT. Right? Because everybody, all the students right now, essentially, I mean, despite all ICML, etc., saying ChatGPT should not be writing the papers, all they're saying is the entire paper should not be written by ChatGPT. You write a paragraph, you give it to ChatGPT to rephrase, look at it, and make sure that it is saying what you wanted said, but in better English. Quote unquote better English that people can understand. It just improves your communication skills. Do you see what I'm saying? Then essentially you would have the best of both worlds. That's not a bad way of using technology because you are in the loop. And you realize that people tend to like better spoken English. They can easily understand better spoken language. I mean, there is this, famous play, I think, Cyrano de Bergerac, I'm not even sure I'm saying it right, about this guy who has this very, completely, deformed long nose, and so he doesn't look beautiful, but his heart is beautiful, he's full of poetry, he's full of all these beautiful thoughts, and he's trying to kind of quote this, the beautiful woman, that's a funny part. Actually, why is the guy who himself thinks that he doesn't satisfy the current standards of beauty, still wants to go for somebody who satisfies the current standards of beauty is a meta problem about that whole story. But he wants to actually quote this woman, and he knows that this woman would be likely to be better quoted if she is quoted by somebody who looks good, but is channeling this guy's words. So ChatGPT is Cyrano de Bergerac, right? It is telling my thoughts in a form that are more easy for you to digest. That's it. But the facts I am controlling. Okay, and those are basically it's a very useful technology. And as I said, continuing the summary part, I mean that basically this is one piece. I mean, generating language that is plausible is something that we didn't think can be done. In fact, it's surprising for people, especially who learned English as foreign language. It should be mind-blowing that ChatGPT will never generate a grammatically incorrect sentence, however long the sentence is. It just doesn't know how to generate grammatically incorrect sentence. Is surprising because it should not be surprising because it's mostly trained on grammatically correct English. To change its thing, you need to actually train on a mixture of grammatically correct and grammatically incorrect English. I don't quite know how it doesn't speak English with I, because they're more Indians and they should be writing a whole bunch of stuff on English on web, but obviously we don't, in India, they don't seem to be putting as much on the web. If they do, at that point, essentially it would basically, it's not really, there's no value judgment. It's essentially just generating what's the most likely completion given the entire corpus it's trained on. But there are other things, after generating plausible text and grammatical text, that's just one piece. That's a great piece, but that's one piece. The expertise in specific domains, etc., that's not something, especially things that involve reasoning and search, ChatGPT can't do. Unless you have reasoned it once and you stored it in your head. So you can always prove that something doesn't require reasoning, it only requires recall if you have seen the question before. I mean, this is the one that I used in the talk too, that, there used to be these interview questions to tell whether people can think critically, like why are manhole covers round? And this was like, basically people will be really surprised when they hear that question and they have to think about it. If you've never heard about this, it's not an obvious, you have to think about what happens if it's in any other shape. And And you have to kind of realize that being round has a special property, which is why, in fact, the manhole covers are round. Not that different from why are wheels round. Right? I'm sure you must have tried like square wheels; they don't work.
Yeah.
Similarly, manhole covers basically, if they're any other shape, if you think about it, I mean, the answer that I'm giving is that like you can manipulate the cover into a position where it will drop down through the hole.
Oh.
So if it is square, let's say, then if it's a square manhole, that's a square cover, then you can put the square, drop it through the diagonal side. So you put the square in the square side, but then drop it through the diagonal side. So there's more space.
Yes.
Circles have the property that you can't drop it. Circle is basically the same size every direction, so you can't manipulate it to drop it down. And in fact, the reason manhole covers have to be, most of the manhole covers are like that, is because people are ultimately, all the good and bad about this world are mostly because of us, the people. And you make manhole covers square, you will find that all the covers are in the bottom because some kid will figure out, and then every other people will come very quickly. But now, see, obviously this requires intelligence, this requires reading, this requires reasoning, blah, 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 geometry, and the fact that, blah, 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 right? Now, I don't know, you look surprised. I guess you are not spending all your time preparing for interviews. But right now, when you ask anybody this question, they know the answer because they've seen the answer. In fact, they'll just say, well, because otherwise it will fall down. And you ask why, sometimes you may not even be able to explain. But they gave the right answer.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So anything that requires reasoning can be memoized. After you reason, remember the answer. When the question comes, you can give the answer back again. These systems can do that.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it becomes actually hard. It's a very interesting battle that one of my tweets, I said that, the broad and shallow systems have this advantage. No, this is fine.
That's fine.
Yeah, we've almost done, I think. So the broad and shallow systems have this thing that it's simultaneously true that they can't do reasoning, for example, or they can't do certain tasks, and yet any benchmark you develop to show that will eventually become fodder for their training, and so they will actually work well on that benchmark. You see what I'm saying? The reason I asked people about, this is well known, this is the reason why, in fact, I was saying this in the talk too, that what students don't understand is the hardest part of the exam is not taking the exam, but setting it. You don't care about it because you don't set it. You mostly take it. My side, I have to set it. Setting an exam that is interesting, that is doable, that actually is not just going to depend on people's rote memory, but requires them to reason, becomes hard and hard. How do you think the JEE, which is supposedly this great exam in India that I certainly passed, and people, so I must be smart, it became like an arms race between people who set the JEE exam and the various coaching agencies who take people and then make them study tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of questions that they have been set, and also more questions, more problems of the same pattern. So every new year, it becomes much harder to bring up yet another mechanics question that hasn't been seen by somebody who basically spent like 5 years of their life doing nothing other than studying for JEE. Now, these people lost 5 years. ChatGPT basically has no life. It essentially has everything on the web available to it. Thankfully, the people actually can do more reasoning, etc. Even the people who actually have studied, looked at too many things beforehand, can still do additional reasoning. ChatGPT cannot. That's why sometimes it fails. But the real reason why it works well on standardized tests is because standardized tests have standardized question banks. Okay? And if you kind of train yourself on the question banks, the odds are quite high that pretty similar questions will come up again. At that point, you can fake reasoning without doing reasoning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think there are lots and lots of, I think, points where it's really critical. And I think what in the earlier podcast that we also covered just with you is the idea of like the subtle research that goes on top of particular AI systems, right? So there is a whole ecosystem of research that is being built on top of AI, which also needs to happen over here in ChatGPT, because we need to understand where, in what cases, like reasoning.
So my I think my version of that, and maybe that would be a great way to end, is that the Santayana basically said, those who don't learn history are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
Right? And the same thing I would tell people, that understand the problems in AI. Take an intro to AI that doesn't start with ChatGPT. The problem with people who start from ChatGPT is they assume that, so it's like there's this thing that for a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right?
Yeah.
So if you think ChatGPT is the solution, then you are essentially looking for problems that it can just solve.
Yeah.
But problems should be first thought of. I mean, what are the core problems of intelligent behavior? Planning, diagnosis, reasoning, etc., etc. And you talk about them in an Intro to AI course. The specific ways we solve those problems might be different, but you need to understand those problems. And you should be able to ask, is ChatGPT or some other technology that you're coming up with, is there any reason to believe that it's capable of solving those problems?
Yeah.
So the advantage I have compared to somebody who starts in AI after ChatGPT is because I know what are the core problems. So I'm both impressed at how surprising it is that in my lifetime, we have systems that can basically answer any question with beautifully written English in any style, in Shakespearean style or in George Bernard Shaw style or in Dave Barry style or whatever. Or they can write poetry, blah, blah, blah. I know that I'm very impressed by them, but at the same time, I know that they can't do search. Because of the way they train, they can't do search. And I know what things require search. And so I know those problems can be done.
Yeah.
Right?
Makes sense. Yeah. On that note, thanks a lot for being here. I think it was very informative even for me. There were a few things that I think I learned, and it's very crucial to be aware of the limitations and what you termed your talk as in like the beauty, the lies of ChatGPT.
Yeah.
It's very important to learn both the sides of this particular wonderful technology.